This video is a story-focused retrospective on the entire Resident Evil franchise. Over the course of 3 parts, we'll be going through all of the Resident Evil games, and I will not only be telling you the stories of these games, you know exactly what's going on, but I'll also be analyzing and critiquing them along the way. I'll be digging into the themes of each game, give my thoughts on whether a specific part of the game's story was done well in my eyes or not, while also discussing development history and some of the design decisions that were made for these games. Welcome to Part 1, which includes the games on screen: Resident Evil 1, 2, 3, Code Veronica, Resident Evil 1 Remake, 0, Outbreak File 1 and 2, as well as Survivor 1 and 2, and Dead Aim. Resident Evil 4 would follow these games, but that will be the start of Part 2. If you like this video, feel free to like and subscribe or donate to the Patreon if you'd like to support me further. And with that out of the way, let's get started. Resident Evil begins by setting up a murder mystery. In the fictional town of Raccoon City, strange reports have come in of missing people and unusual sightings. A special task force within the police known as STARS was contacted to deal with the issue. The STARS Bravo team was sent in first, but their helicopter crashed and contact with the team was lost. An Alpha team was then sent in to find them and figure out what's going on. Alpha team is made up of our main cast: Chris Redfield, Jill Valentine, Barry Burton, and Albert Wesker, with Rebecca Chambers being the only member of Bravo team to be shown here. After an ambush from some dogs, the team is forced to flee, seeking cover in the only available shelter. But one could argue that the mansion out here in the woods is far more dangerous than the forest outside, where the entire mansion has been overrun with zombies. And thus our story truly begins. Resident Evil 1 has a great intro filled with mystery and intrigue, but the idea of trapping the main cast in a style like this actually came from the game that inspired Resident Evil in the first place. Many know that Resident Evil's origins began with a game known as Sweet Home, a game about a film crew who came to an abandoned manor to publish and document left-behind artwork from a famous painter, before ultimately being trapped in said manor as they now have to find a way to escape with their lives. It was developed by Takuro Fujiwara, who had later asked his apprentice Shinji Mikami to make a horror game based on the systems of Sweet Home. Shinji Mikami took many ideas from Sweet Home and put them in Resident Evil. The entire mansion of Sweet Home is filled with locked doors and keys. Items and files can be picked up and read to gain a better understanding of the lore, and even the classic loading screen door was taken from the game as well. The only thing that was left was the name. They initially wanted to call it Biohazard, the name that it's currently using in Japan, but due to a rock band based in New York and a game that's already taken that title, the office held a vote for the North American version. They decided on Resident Evil because they liked the clever pun of the residents of the manor being evil, so if anyone ever yells at you for the pun, just know the devs thought of it first. This also fulfills my quota of making a evil residents joke this early in the video. You're welcome. Sweet Home is often credited as the first survival horror game, but in terms of popularity and cultural relevance, it was Resident Evil that took that crown, and it's thanks to the series that survival horror even really exists as a genre of game. Things we've come to associate with survival horror elements in modern games likely stem from Resident Evil, but as we've seen, Resident Evil's inspiration can be traced back even further to Sweet Home, inspirations that would eventually lead to the game we all know and love. But before we begin the game, Resident Evil asks us to pick between Jill and Chris. After choosing the character you want, the rest of the game involves you investigating the whereabouts of Bravo team and figuring out what the hell is going on here. Most of Resident Evil's story though is told through the environment and the notes. The current, present story is light on details. There could be long stretches of gameplay that contain no narrative significance. That isn't to say it's bad by any means, because the notes and few interactions you do have are all you need to piece things together. Scattered across the mansion are various files, all of which provide background information critical to understanding the outbreak. The various rooms with beds, activities, and bars implies that this was an on-site setting, where researchers would stay and experiment. A keeper at the mansion left their diary behind and details their slow descent into madness. They started feeling weird pains in their body and blisters on their foot. The keeper asked to go home for the day, but was denied and told to stay here. They wouldn't even let them make a phone call. Someone was also shot trying to escape. The last few entries show their vocab getting worse, as they're too focused on feasting, before the iconic itchy tasty line appears. A researcher within the mansion also wrote a goodbye note, saying that they were infected, but chose to go out their own way. These provide us with more questions as to the nature of this place. It's clear that the staff was attacked, and thanks to decades of zombie media, we can assume that an outbreak had occurred. But how? The slight teases of information given here are not only interesting, but by having them revealed through in-game notes rather than through exposition, it lets the players focus on their priorities. Those who care about the outbreak and the disaster can read the notes, while those here for a survival horror experience can just enjoy the gameplay without being impeded too much. Although it does feel like you're meant to get wrapped up in the story through these notes, as some of them do provide hints to puzzles. But this game places such a focus on this part of the story that it does tend to forget to extend that same courtesy to its own cast. Very little is known about these characters, and the only thing most people remember about them was the lines or nicknames they had. such as Miss Jill Sandwich herself, the master of unlocking, two iconic memes that spawned from this game and have continued to be referenced within the franchise. This is also hampered by some pretty poor voice acting that stifles any potential for good storytelling.
Stop it! Don't open that door!
What? Oh no!
That was too close. You were almost a Jill Sandwich.
You're right.
Honestly, these scenes are pretty dumb at times, but I do have to admit that I find them a little charming. Resident Evil has always been known for being over the top, like how in order to complete a puzzle, Chris has to have Rebecca play Moonlight Sonata for him on a piano. This isn't exactly strange, but neither of them knows this leads to a secret room, so she's just playing the piano in the middle of this mansion. It's so incredibly stupid if you think about it for more than 2 seconds, but I can't help but appreciate the wackiness of it all. But if you don't enjoy the story of Resident Evil, that's okay, because the game does let you take the reins for a bit and dictate your own story. Choosing between Jill and Chris can change things. The biggest difference is the characters. Jill is joined by Barry Burton, while Chris's partner is Rebecca Chambers. Barry and Rebecca only exist in those respective playthroughs, so Chris will never meet Barry, as it's assumed that he died in that playthrough. Although that doesn't mean the others will survive either. Something Resident Evil lost as the series continued was in-game choices. At multiple points throughout the playthrough, you'll be asked to make a choice, and these can alter how the game develops. For example, you may find Richard, one of the members of Bravo team. He asks you to get some serum for him because he was bitten by a large snake. If you take too long, he'll be dead by the time you get back. Doing this, though, means you get to save the serum for yourself. For Chris specifically, if Richard is dead, that means later when he fights Plan 42, Rebecca will have to save him by creating a poison in the room next door and using it on the roots. If you do save him, then there is no scene here with Rebecca, so Chris has to fight it at full strength. I'm using footage of the first game's remake because I couldn't get this in the original, but the outcome is the same. Similarly, halfway through the game, hunters start being introduced. As Jill, there is a moment where Barry asks if you'd like to stick together, and if he should go ahead. If you let him go first, he's attacked by a hunter. If you take too long or go through the wrong door, he'll die. At the end of the game, you'll also find the other protagonist in a jail cell. You can unlock the door during the final countdown, but if you forget and leave them behind, they don't get on the helicopter. This can change the end slides that show who made it out alive. Resident Evil will rarely, if ever, return to this style again. Most of the games focus on singular narratives with no branching choices, and those that do usually have one big decision, not small ones like this. Here in the early era of the franchise, though, it's all about choice, and we'll see this pop up in the other games as well, especially Resident Evil 3. It's a style that I actually miss, if it's even possible to miss something you just experienced for the first time. I'm not expecting Resident Evil to have multiple endings, but I think small changes during the playthrough, like the difficulty of the boss or a unique cutscene that only triggers at certain moments, is a lost art for the franchise, and one that I hope returns sometime in the future. Case in point, the characters of Resident Evil are frail. Plot armor does not exist yet for them, a rather stark contrast to the kind of situations they seem to survive in the future. But for one, that plot armor was always there. The one who survives no matter the playthrough is the captain, Albert Wesker, and there is a reason for that. After your first encounter with the undead, you'll find that Wesker has run off either with Jill or by himself. He only returns after you kill Plan 42, where he is casually seen killing some undead, as if he hasn't been gone for the past few hours. It's not for another few hours when Jill or Chris learn the truth. Hidden beneath the mansion is a laboratory that's been creating and experimenting on the very same creatures they've run across. There is a slideshow that has all the creatures labeled. It's even learned that the stars were to be lured here and tested against their tyrant. Through some knowledge gained both in and out of game, the main culprit of the outbreak is a pharmaceutical company called Umbrella. They created a virus known as the T-Virus, a deadly bioweapon they could sell to the highest bidder. They used this T-Virus to create BOWs or bioorganic weapons, such as the Tyrant, considered the ultimate lifeform. The numerous labs, computers, and data all document these procedures. So they knew what they were doing down here, they were just too overzealous and paid the price for their hubris. To remove their presence, they planned on blowing this place up and removing any evidence they could. That's where Wesker comes in. He's mentioned in one of the files down here, so he's a prominent member of the staff. Wesker was to lure the stars here, take some of the Tyrant embryos, and make the destruction of the mansion look like an accident. In doing so, he had to kill some of Bravo team like Enrico, who was close to revealing his true intentions. But Wesker plans to double-cross Umbrella and use the virus for its own purposes, although we aren't sure of the specifics. But it all fell apart when he released the Tyrant on the cast, as Tyrant took Wesker out first before being stopped by Jill or Chris. As they leave, Chris comforts Rebecca as she was shot by Wesker, only to reveal that it hit her bulletproof vest, while Barry, who initially betrayed Jill because Wesker threatened his family, turned on Wesker and knocked him out before he could open the Tyrant tube, although they open it anyway to kill it. Rebecca then blows up the facility in Chris's campaign, assuming she's alive, where Wesker regains consciousness and sets the place to blow before dying to some of the infected down here, forcing Jill and Barry to race out of the lab before they're taken with it. This leads to a final fight with the Tyrant, where you have to use a rocket launcher to destroy it. Once done, the game ends, and your ending will play as you escape the facility. So what's the canon ending? Hilariously, none of them, as Rebecca and Barry both make it out alive despite not appearing in one of the playthroughs, ending the game on a rather odd note if you're familiar with the future games yet to be discussed. Resident Evil 1 is an iconic first step for the franchise. Voice acting aside, the rest of the game is fantastic. Shinji Mikami at the time felt that Resident Evil did not need a sequel and never anticipated the franchise's future success. It's interesting to see though, with 30 years of hindsight, just how much this game became an influence on the series. The first Resident Evil establishes many different designs and ideas that later games will continue to use. Everything from save rooms and herbs as healing items to limited inventory and puzzles, even how the final bosses kill with some explosive weapon. Usually the first crack at something is shoddy and not always put together well. Refinement often leads to establishment, but Resident Evil nailed it in one. It's a game that continues to influence the newer games within the franchise, on top of the many games from other series that would come after. While some later games in the franchise can be held in high esteem for how they reinvented or revived Resident Evil, much of the franchise's future success can still be drawn from Resident Evil 1. It's a game with an incredibly forward-thinking approach to game design. A game that took inspiration from others only to be the thing that inspired the next generation, popularizing the now widely known survival horror genre. So with all this in mind, let's see what the next 30 years have in store for us. Shall we? Thanks to their newfound success, Capcom continued to work on Resident Evil games. Shinji Mikami would step down as director and would become producer of Resident Evil 2, while the director role was given to Hideki Kamiya. You may know of Kamiya as the man who directed Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, but this would be years before that. He worked as a systems planner on Resident Evil 1 before being given the reins of Resident Evil 2. The team brought lots of unique ideas to the table, such as two new characters, Leon Kennedy and Elza Walker. Leon was to be a rookie cop who was at the police station during the next outbreak, while Elza was a motorcycle racer in Raccoon City. They also met a few notable side characters like the Birkins, Marvin, and an Umbrella researcher named Linda. A new location in the form of the Raccoon City Police Department was added, and monsters can mutate over the course of the game. But the dev team soon found the game uninteresting, despite all the changes that were made. There were more zombies than ever before, but they needed to lower the polygon counts of the models to get this many on the PlayStation 1 hardware, which in turn made the zombies look less threatening. And the police department had 3 fleshed out floors and a basement, yet they all looked the same. Capcom then brought in TV writer Noboru Sugimura, who at the time wrote scenarios for TV shows like Super Sentai and Kamen Rider Black. Sugimura was a fan of the first Resident Evil game, so they brought him in as a consultant, knowing that his professional work could give the game a much needed polish. Sugimura then suggested they start from scratch. This delay forced Capcom to make something quick to avoid a long hiatus, which is what led to the director's cut of Resident Evil 1, which I'll talk about later. Despite starting over though, it was clear that the team had a solid foundation. They just needed to see things from a different angle. Much of the old build, now dubbed Resident Evil 1.5 by fans, still exists within Resident Evil 2 today. The police department, the 2 campaigns, and the side characters like Marvin and the Birkins still exist, but some things didn't make the cut. Leon was still a cop for the RPD, but he arrived late to work on his first day, which spared his life. Elza Walker was replaced by Claire Redfield, sister to Chris Redfield, to give the game a connection to the first. They also changed her outfit, but did make it a costume in the remake as a nod to this old build 20 years later. While Linda was then replaced by Ada Wong, who will become a mainstay within the franchise going forward. And Claire and Leon's campaigns would actually intertwine as the two would often meet, rather than have Leon and Elza go through different journeys alone. Then, after an apology from Capcom for the delay and lots of work behind the scenes, this new Resident Evil 2 was finally complete. Resident Evil 2 begins by having you choose between Leon and Claire. Leon's new story is that he is a cop with the RPD who recently broke up with his girlfriend. On the way to Raccoon City, he stopped at a motel and got drunk, completely missing his first day. He still heads to Raccoon City anyway when he gets up, as you can only be late once. At the same time, Claire Redfield is here searching for her brother Chris, who went missing 2 months ago when he went to the Arklay Mountains. Both find each other at a gas station before they run into the hordes of the undead. It seems the virus wasn't just confined to the Arklay Mountains after all. The two crashed on the way and need to split up, and thus begins the journey of whoever you choose. Resident Evil 2 is a prime example of what can happen when a team learns from its past work. The RPD is one of the most visually stunning locations in the franchise. The pre-rendered background era of Resident Evil is still alive and well, and will stay like that for a few more entries. There is a wealth of complexity in a lot of these backgrounds, and provides more stories than words could ever tell. The crashed cars, burning buildings, and blocked exits all convey a city under siege. Bodies are found in numerous places and positions, showing us how quickly the outbreak took people off guard. A gun shop owner named Kendo barricaded himself in his store to hide from the undead, but they still broke in. I also have to respect the amount of detail that was put into a section of the game that only lasts a few minutes and is never seen again. Most of the game takes place inside the police station. These burned city streets only exist for the opening. But I was always taught to put your best foot forward in life, and I feel as though that statement can be applied to the cityscape of Raccoon City. Going inside the police station, these feelings are amplified tenfold. While the main foyer conveys the police station's grand sense of scale and authority, every room inside is torn apart. The main office has desks with their contents toppled over. There's even a rather sad showing of a banner and balloons for Leon. A note in-game was written by the team congratulating Leon on his new position and how they're eager to work with him. They never met the guy, but they had a great deal of respect for him. The rest of the buildings have similar clutter, but it's unclear if this was a result of the outbreak. The Star's office is covered and left behind paperwork and boxes. Like any office, people like to personalize their environment to reflect themselves. We can find the desk of presumably Jill, Barry, and Chris. On one desk are parts of a weapon with the description noting that Barry is a part of the NRA. Jill's beret is found on another desk. It also contains a possible photo of her boyfriend, although this was retconned in some interviews to simply be a friend. The remake also replaced it with a dog, so clearly this wasn't intended. Chris has a jacket similar to the one Claire wears near his desk, even has a diary that shows us the report he made about the incident at the mansion. It was mentioned by Marvin earlier that when the Stars returned to the RPD, Chris tried to break the story on Umbrella and their schemes, but no one listened. Through their findings, they were able to find info on the G virus, the new virus in this game, but seeing no other options, Chris headed to Europe, where Umbrella's headquarters are, which is the bridge that connects this game to Code Veronica. These small, insignificant pieces of the background serve zero purpose to the gameplay, and are so forgettable that you probably skip by them without even noticing. They often say that a picture is worth 1,000 words, and nowhere is that statement truer than the pre-rendered backgrounds of Resident Evil 2. But as mentioned earlier, you'll be exploring this station with whomever you end up choosing, either Claire or Leon. Unlike Resident Evil 1 though, where the campaign was roughly the same, Resident Evil 2's campaigns are intended to be different experiences. Leon and Claire have what's called an A and B playthrough. There isn't exactly a wrong choice of who to play first, since the story is conveyed throughout all 4 runs, but it's intended that you pick the other character after the first. Hideki Kamiya created what's known as the zapping system, where actions taken during the A playthrough can affect the B playthrough. For example, Marvin, one of the cops at the RPD, will become infected partway through the game. If you choose to keep him alive in the A playthrough, he will still be there during the B playthrough. Down in the parking lot is a weapons locker with a machine gun and a small pack. Whatever you don't choose can be kept in the locker for the B playthrough, while any items taken during the A playthrough will not reappear on the second run. Further, you also approach the map differently. A playthroughs go through the front while B playthroughs come from the side of the police station. This means that certain moments, like when the helicopter crashes into the RPD, are seen earlier in B than they are in A. Now, as complex as it sounds, the game doesn't actually take everything into account. While some items have a zapping feature applied to them, it's only a couple. Items like herbs and ammo will retain their place on the map across the playthroughs even if they were picked up, so you don't need to prepare for 2 playthroughs. And while Marvin can survive across the playthroughs, he is the only exception. Still, it's an incredibly ambitious idea and part of the charm of Resident Evil 2. What's even more impressive is how this feature actually has more changes that involve the script rather than the gameplay. Leon and Claire have 2 fundamentally different stories that, when put together, create the narrative. This does mean that you will have to play the game 4 times to understand everything, but I found that the changes were enough to keep me interested. Mainly because RE2 has both scenario and character-based encounters. For example, Leon and Claire have 2 characters in the supporting cast exclusive to their playthrough. Ada and Ben for Leon, Sherry and Chief Irons for Claire. These then are character-based. An enemy that becomes synonymous with Resident Evil 2 is the T-103 unit, often given the nickname outside the games as Mr. X. He only appears in the B playthrough to up the difficulty now that you've had more familiarity with the police station. He is scenario-driven, as the A playthrough will never encounter him no matter who you choose. This clash of character and scenario-driven encounters is what creates the complexity, and why there are basically 4 separate stories. For example, Claire and Sherry will at one point continue their escape out of the RPD. Sherry is then whisked away by the tide of the sewer system and loses sight of Claire. Sherry then tries to make her way back to Claire, but she will either successfully find her later near a tram, or she will fall into a garbage chute and be knocked unconscious. William Birkin, the main villain of this game, will also come by and infect Sherry, which forces Claire to make a cure, something she doesn't have to do in the other playthrough. This also has an impact on smaller events that are less consequential. The A playthrough is usually ahead of the B playthrough, so the A playthroughs take the train all the way to the Umbrella Laboratory first. but because the B playthrough gets there second, they not only have to call the train back up to the top, but the key to start the train is already in the keyhole thanks to the A playthrough. This kind of slight tweaking of events happens all the time, taking the independent and dependent variables and mashing them together to get something unique. It is utterly bewildering to me even now how this game was designed with 2 characters and 4 separate playthroughs in mind. It also makes your singular experience not feel like the only thing going on right now. Having Leon and Claire interact outside their stories makes it seem like the world is moving on while you work. The game even offers up a few sections for Ada and Sherry. They're not super amazing and only last a few minutes, but like the brief sections with Rebecca, it offers up a nice change of pace that is always welcome. That's why regardless of who you choose, you should pick the other characters next, as by not doing so, you play the game in a way that's not intended to be experienced and miss out on the beauty of the system. The A and B zap system is truly the highlight of Resident Evil 2. It's one of the reasons the original game has quickly become one of my favorites in the franchise. It's an incredibly complex yet genius design choice that solves the problem the other game had, which was how to tell 2 stories at once. What's even more impressive is how the team was able to weave a well-thought-out narrative within this ambitious system. Claire's story is arguably the one we should start with first, as it's more focused on the Outbreak. While trying to find information on her brother, she comes across the STARS office. That's when she'll learn of her brother's trip to Europe. See, Chris had asked the federal government to conduct an internal investigation, and they have their report. Info regarding the G-Virus, though, was inconclusive. No such mention of the thing was found. The rest is a background check on Police Chief Brian Irons. Chief Irons was arrested under suspicion of sexual assault back when he was a college student, but there wasn't enough evidence to make a proper charge. He also recently received large sums of money from an account linked to Umbrella, and was very likely involved in covering up what happened at the mansion in the last game. Meeting with Irons establishes pretty quickly what we're dealing with here. You first find him at his desk with the body of the mayor's daughter on the table. He mourns her loss and is deeply saddened by her passing, asking Claire to leave him be so that he can be alone. While this seems like a man grieving over a dying friend, his initial comment about her beautiful soft skin and his unprompted mention of his taxidermy hobby implies that he killed her and plans to preserve her corpse for himself. In truth, Chief Irons has been under Umbrella's command for quite some time. Umbrella controls most of Raccoon City. They have a majority stake in the city's buildings and services. By buying Chief Irons, they were able to conduct their operations in peace, while he thwarts his own police force. Prior to the outbreak starting, he initially made evacuation harder by cutting off communication from the outside world. He also moved lots of ammo to his storage unit downstairs, away from where most of the officers are, so they would have a harder time defending themselves. He also used the police station as a way to get the people to stay within the city and not leave, and thus couldn't tell the world about the outbreak. But then he had a change of heart the following day, which is when he then decided to hunt down everyone in the police station himself. He sadistically comments on the expression of one of the officers as they had died in front of him, and how he intentionally let the mayor's daughter escape so that he could hunt her down. Behind a secret door in his office is his dungeon. It's filled with chemicals like chloroform and other cleaning agents, and there are numerous sharp cutting tools and fresh blood on the table. He's a sick individual who's done all this sabotage for money, and instead of helping people and seeing the error of his ways, he now indulges in his sick, perverted fantasies. He's utterly lost his mind, if he ever had it to begin with, because he thought that Umbrella would be on his side, but after the experiments decimated his town, he's trying to kill everyone he can, possibly with the intent of moving on to Umbrella after. But he too would be killed like all the others, either mauled to death or implanted with an embryo that, like a chest burster from Alien, comes out of his body. When it's not about Chief Irons, though, the rest of the story deals with a little girl named Sherry. Sherry's found wandering the halls of the RPD, a pretty terrible place to be at the moment. Claire quickly assumes a rather motherly role when taking care of Sherry. Sherry Birkin is revealed to be the daughter of Annette and William Birkin, the 2 scientists responsible for this outbreak, although she does not know what's going on. I find the dynamic between these two really sweet, actually. Just the amount of times they hug or when Sherry puts her hand on Claire's shoulder, it's really sweet. Sherry was a neglected child. Her parents were more married to their work than to each other and cared very little for their daughter. It's led Sherry to see Claire as a dear friend and someone she can look up to. I think it shows both the courage Claire has that she's willing to help anyone she can, especially a little girl, even though she has her own mission to deal with, while also painting a clearer picture of the Birkin family, one that gets more vivid with time. There's also a semblance of a clash between her and Annette, between the mother and the mother who stepped up, so to speak. Sherry ends up siding with Claire more because of the bare minimum amount of care that she gives her, but she does still love her parents. Annette, though, cares very little about Sherry. At least it seems that way, until she learns that Sherry's down here in the sewers with her. She told her to stay at the police station so that she could be safe, but obviously that's changed now. So it's clear that Annette cares about Sherry, just maybe not to the degree you'd expect a mother to. But when Claire mentions that Sherry is down here, Annette quickly understands that both Sherry and the G-Virus are in danger. Mr. X, the tyrant we talked about earlier, was hired to clean up this mess, destroy evidence, and retrieve a sample of the G-Virus for Umbrella. It's learned that Sherry has a sample of it in her pendant, so the beast is after her. Claire fights off Mr. X while Sherry escapes. She then comes across Annette while Sherry sits over her mother's body. With her dying breath, she tells her how much she loved her, and that despite being a terrible mother, she did care about her. But due to various choices, Mr. X may not attack Sherry, as Claire will not encounter Mr. X during her A playthrough. In said playthrough, William chases and infects Sherry. Claire and Annette work together to stop William before he hurts his own daughter and implants her with a G-Virus embryo. But by the time she gets to her, she's already been infected, so the rest of the story revolves around finding a cure for Sherry before she's killed. So rather than talk to Sherry with her dying breath, she tells Claire how to prepare a vaccine, the final wish of a dying mother. I like this interpretation of the events more. It adds more stakes and actually gets the major characters involved, rather than having Sherry just be a bit of a hindrance. Overall, I found Claire's story to be quite intriguing. The characterization of Claire as a parental figure for Sherry is sweet and tells us a great deal about who she is as a person through her actions. But of course, this is just one side of the story. We need to know the other to see how it all comes together, as Leon's story takes another look at this plot from a different angle. His story begins when he meets with a woman named Ada Wong. As mentioned earlier, Ada was initially Linda. Part of why she became Ada is likely for the same reason they made Claire in the end. A computer lab underneath the mansion in the first game belonged to a man named John, claiming to be the lover of Ada. Her name was also the password for this computer. He wrote a letter to her letting her know that he was infected and that she needed to take all the info about the lab, like the slideshow, and make it public. Ada has come here to the precinct to find a man named Ben, as that would lead her to John. We know John is nothing but Ash at this point, so Ada's in for a bit of a rude awakening. Ben, though, is a journalist. He's going to blow the whistle on this whole thing with Umbrella and the G-Virus, but was in prison before he could get the word out. Basically, William and Annette Birkin are scientists who work for Umbrella. They are the creators of the G-Virus, a descendant of the T-Virus from Resident Evil 1 that claims to be better and stronger than it. They seem purely interested in the research and skillful experimentation of the virus, but William became too attached to his work. Umbrella had planned to take this research of his and use it for their own gain. Once more, the remake elaborates a bit by claiming that William was going to sell it off before Umbrella got a hold of it and sold it for themselves. Leaving Umbrella without much choice, they sent in a squad of soldiers to take Birkin down. They quickly killed Birkin and retrieved the samples, but unwilling to let his creation go, he injected himself with a sample of the G-Virus he kept for himself, which turned him into the terrifying monster that he is. Annette has been trying to calm things down in the lab since William had been wreaking havoc on the facility, but William had broken out and started making a mess of the place. Further, the G-Virus was not the only sample William was carrying. He also had with him a different strain of the T-Virus. This was spilled on the ground and consumed by rats, who spread it to the local populace. This explains why there are new variants like the Lickers, enemies who had not been seen in the mansion. Worse, according to Annette, those of the G-Virus can implant embryos into people and make more G creatures. Most reject this bonding, which is likely what happened to Ben and Chief Irons, but others like Sherry bond with it well. So the virus can create more monsters that can then create more offspring continually. Learning of this, Ada and Leon then plan to work together to stop Umbrella and the Birkins. But it's learned pretty quickly though that Ada is just using Leon for her own gain. Ada is here for the G-Virus. She plans to make off with its contents and bring it back to whoever hired her for the job. This would slowly become a well-known characterization for Ada. She becomes a major character in the franchise from this point forward, popping up in a few games throughout the series, continuing to follow this style of work. Oddly enough, all of her appearances almost always involve Leon in some way, which leads to a rather complicated relationship between the two. Leon is always trying to save people, and Ada is always doing her job, which often leads to her working against Leon. It's a dynamic we'll return to frequently, but here in this early era it's more about introductions and setting up this series-long relationship. Contrasting well to Ada's cold and calculated demeanor, Leon is someone who wants to do good. He sees the good in lots of people, even Ada. He's incredibly inexperienced, which is why Ada finds it easy to manipulate him, but it also shows his own heroism. It's his first day on the job and he's dealing with a zombie outbreak already. It's a day that he would continue to remember as we get deeper into the franchise, but it's never once stopped him from doing what's right. I find this kind of positivity infectious, pun intended. It's nice knowing that there's always someone willing to do good, no matter how bad it gets in these games. But that doesn't make the betrayal sting any less. So firstly, Ada doesn't technically betray Leon during the B playthrough. Annette tells Leon of Ada's true nature, that she is from the agency, and that she was sent here to obtain a sample of the G-Virus. But he finds this revelation hard to believe, claiming that he knows Ada better. But in this playthrough, Ada already finds the sample she's looking for, so she doesn't need to take it from Leon or Annette. Even still, despite having what she came for, she comes to Leon's aid when he's attacked by Mr. X, even taking a fatal injury from it. She'd sooner sacrifice her own safety than let Leon die. Leon's A side is just as good. In this instance, Ada doesn't have the sample, so she has to steal it off Leon. He refuses to give it up, especially now that he knows that Annette was telling the truth about Ada. But as the two have a bit of a standoff, Annette decides the duel by shooting Ada. The pain makes her stumble and fall off the ledge. Leon grabs her and tries to pull her up, but Ada knows it's too late. As she falls, Leon is crushed. This hurts all the more when you examine her gun and realize it was empty. She never intended to shoot Leon. Ada just hoped that he would give up the sample, but he was too stubborn to do so. Ada confesses that she appreciates Leon's company, and that even though they've only known each other for a short time, she does care about him and does not want him to die, because ultimately that's what scares her the most. She knows that completing her mission means betraying Leon, and she does not want Leon to be a casualty. It led to her feeling stuck in a tug of war, between doing what she wants over what she needs to do. She can't have Leon and the G-Virus together. She needs to choose. But Annette chose for her. This kind of emotional send-off is rare for the franchise. It's always focused on the bioweapons and the zombies. But every so often we get brief moments like this, and I always cherish them. It's a rare look at the human cost of the bioweapons, the people who are killed or have to sacrifice their lives to stop a conflict, even when the next one comes just months later. Those kinds of moments are often Resident Evil at its very best. Now, a lot of this emotional payoff is completely squandered by the fact that Ada appears at the end of the game to help the B character fight off Mr. X, thus removing all the emotional weight from these scenes. But because Ada keeps reappearing in the franchise, I feel less bad about it, since it would give us more moments of tension like this between the two. Had she just survived and never returned like many of the side characters in this game, I think I'd be a bit more annoyed. But as a whole, Leon's campaign is one of the best, just as good as Claire's, although for different reasons. Eventually though, you will reach a point where both playthroughs converge. A self-destruct sequence for the base goes off, forcing both characters to run. The A character fights Birkin for the final time and gets on one of the trains, while the B character has to actually get the train running, forcing them into an encounter with a souped-up Mr. X. This is also when Ada will appear to drop a rocket launcher for the B character, disproving her death. They then get aboard the train, but have to fight William again, who is insistent on killing them. The B character holds them off while they stop the train, as the timer for the self-destruct sequence on the train, they have a lot of these it seems, goes off and threatens to take the crew with it. Upon doing so, they escape from a tunnel and survive the blast that takes William, as the three rest knowing that they survived. Although there is still work to be done. Umbrella is still out there, and so is Chris, so we'll be heading to Europe very soon. Now, I do admit that this retelling was rather disjointed. I mean, we talked about William's antics in Claire's section, but didn't bring up all of it until Leon's, but that's just how this story is told. You learn the pieces of the story one playthrough at a time. Most of the Resident Evil franchise focuses on singular narratives. We wouldn't see this kind of dual style again until technically Resident Evil 6. I think that's what makes Resident Evil 2 so unique to me. I really come around to games that try to do something different or ask the player to go out of their way to experience it. A game that comes to mind is the more recent Silent Hill F, where its narrative is two interpretations. One is about a direct story that's happening in front of the player's eyes, while the other is filled with metaphors. That game also made you play it through multiple times to get the full story. Unorthodox approaches like this are something I appreciate, and I think that stems from playing over a decade of games that are often very direct in their storytelling. Not that there's an issue with that, of course, but with how many games that are out there that follow this path, it almost makes the others that don't stand out more, and Resident Evil 2 is one of those games. Rather than tell a single narrative or just split it up into two journeys like the original version of the game, they not only interweave both tales but create enough changes to justify a third and fourth run to uncover the full truth. It's like assembling the pieces of a puzzle. After you finish, you could step back and examine the full piece, knowing that the fun comes from both the finished product and the time invested in finishing it. But I can also see how this can cause some issues amongst fans. It's nice to be able to experience a story, even a dual one like this, without having to replay the same content over and over. Having a singularly focused story also leaves little room for error, something baked into the DNA of Resident Evil 2. Claire and Leon go through similar events to an extent. The FMV that played of William's death is something you can watch during Claire or Ada's talk with Annette. They both play out during the character's A playthrough, so it can be hard to piece together who is actually doing what. While technically all 4 playthroughs are canon, Claire's A then Leon's B seems to be widely regarded as the most canon, if that makes any sense, since it has the final meeting with Ada, the moment during the boss fight after her supposed death, as well as the virus that infected Sherry, that last one being mentioned in RE6. But the answer to this long debated question of canonicity, on top of the numerous playthroughs required to get the full story, is explicitly why the remake would alter its story to accommodate this. So I can sympathize with those that feel that 4 playthroughs is exhausting. But I can't help but feel a deep appreciation for this rather unique take on storytelling, especially for a game made in 1998. But the Raccoon City disaster was only just the beginning. Resident Evil 2 showed us 2 POVs, but they were of the same attack. What else was going on during the outbreak? Well, that way of thinking is how we got Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, although it didn't always start that way. Due to the back-to-back success of the previous 2 games, Capcom started greenlighting multiple projects. The first was a game for the Sega Dreamcast, which would eventually become Code Veronica. Another began in the Nintendo 64, but would later be moved to the GameCube, which became Resident Evil 0. A third was titled Resident Evil Gaiden, not to be confused with the actual Resident Evil Gaiden, and a fourth was being directed by Hideki Kamiya again, which was intended to be the next main entry in the franchise. As outlined by the fansite Project Umbrella, Kamiya's new game, the then titled Biohazard 3, was meant to star Hunk, protagonist of the 4th Survivor game mode from RE2, as he stows himself aboard a cruise ship to steal a sample of the G virus. Kamiya and the team, however, ran into a problem, as Sony had announced its newest generation of console, the PlayStation 2. Hoping to capitalize on the new market, Kamiya's team would shift focus and make their new game for the PS2. This created a bit of a complication. Code Veronica was going to go to the Dreamcast, RE0 had just started development, and Kamiya's team needed to understand the PS2's hardware so they could deliver the quality fans expected. So Kazuhira Oyama, director for the Gaiden title, was then told that his game would then be upgraded to the last numbered entry in the Resident Evil series for the PS1. With the priorities being shifted, significant chunks of the game had to be changed though. What was initially going to be a simple look at the outbreak from a survivor's perspective turned into what we now know as Resident Evil 3. Resident Evil 3 takes place at the same time as RE2, but we get to see a different side of the outbreak, specifically through the eyes of Jill Valentine. RE3 begins with a rather explosive intro. Quite literally. Police and SWAT are gunning down dozens and hundreds of zombies. If it wasn't clear from the opening, this game is going to be a bit more action-focused. According to a journal, Barry and Jill planned on following Chris to Europe. Barry was first going to get his family to Canada and then join Chris in Europe. But Jill stayed in Raccoon City because she was given info by Chris on the G virus. So she had stayed behind to try and find this research facility prior to the outbreak. Jill is then blown out of her apartment and is quickly surrounded by the undead. Making her way inside a warehouse, she finds some momentary peace of mind, just enough for her to gather her thoughts and figure out how to escape this city with her life. That's the name of the game here in RE3, Escape, by any means necessary. But as this was a shorter game with a shorter development time, the game feels a lot like RE2, much to its benefit. Rather than go to 3D, something that was slowly becoming more mainstream, Capcom continued to keep the pre-rendered backgrounds as they felt they couldn't fulfill their vision with just 3D. RE3 looks much better as a result. To portray the outbreak effectively, the pre-rendered backgrounds are made to convey death and destruction on a grand scale, while 3D was used for effects like fire and water. Dead bodies have been painted into the background with destroyed vehicles, busted up windows, trash, and other items out on the street, all used as a way to showcase how utterly devastated the city was during the attack. New designs were also given to the zombies to reflect the diverse nature of the city, on top of increasing the amount per screen, reinforcing just how many people were infected. Strangely, there are times when zombies reappear in areas you've already traveled through, making return trips harder. Survivors can also be found in the streets, although only for a short while, as they'll be dead not long after. It feels like the city is truly moving on without you, and is slowly getting more overrun the longer you take. It makes Jill's goal of escaping all the more desperate, as the city falls apart with each passing hour. So it seems like Jill is going to have a lot on her plate, and unfortunately she's going to be having seconds whether she likes it or not. Not too long after starting, Jill meets with Brad, the pilot from RE1. Brad immediately takes off to the RPD, claiming that something is out there and is chasing them. Soon after, Jill gets to meet with her RE3 nemesis, aptly named Nemesis. RE3 was the first game in the series to have a subtitle like this. I can imagine this was done to project a certain understanding about the world into the player. No longer are we dealing with experiments and mysteries. It's a 1v1 between Jill and her nemesis. The nemesis was created by Umbrella. The original doesn't actually explain how it was made, but future games will retroactively say that it was an experiment that involved the old tyrant form and a nemesis parasite. Airlifted by a carrier, this being was trained in a lab to hunt down STARS members, and definitely make sure that you remember that. STARS. Now to be fair, its obsession with the STARS isn't actually for any particular reason, it seems. Umbrella just wanted to keep the nemesis in Raccoon City, so they used the STARS as test subjects since they were localized to the city, and a strong contender against the nemesis which could provide some valuable combat data. The nemesis in RE3 is the highlight. His name and likeness are on the box after all. You run into him numerous times throughout the game, and at which point you're forced to make a choice: fight or run. Fighting the nemesis like Mr. X does reward you with gear if you kill him. The only caveat is you have to kill him. Running away is a valid choice, but that also comes with some caveats of its own. Unlike Mr. X, who only stayed on one screen, Nemesis can actually chase you across the screens. This totally changes the dynamic of the fight, as now you have to take into account the areas that you're in. It's something that's always in the back of your mind as you wonder when he'll show up next, and oftentimes it's a matter of when and not if, as this guy does not go down easily. But that is not to say that you are simply wasting time trying to fight him. On top of the rewards you acquire through its momentary deaths, his appearance and your subsequent reaction can change how the story plays out. At certain intervals, an event will trigger that will give you a choice. These don't always involve the nemesis, but most often do. These are basically QuickTime events where you have to choose between two options, and you must choose, otherwise you'll suffer some health loss as a result of your indecision. Interestingly, the game calls these live selections. QuickTime events, at least in the way that we know them as, didn't really appear until 1999 with the release of Shenmue. Its creator Yu Suzuki was the one who coined the term, as the manual called them QTEs or QuickTimer events. That game released in December of 1999, a mere 4 months after Resident Evil 3, making RE3 a kind of a precursor to the current style that we've grown accustomed to. Just another feather in its cap, I suppose. But more than just the QTEs and the fights, narratively Capcom went to great lengths to make sure he earns that title of Nemesis. He kills a few of Jill's allies throughout the game, such as Brad and a future character named Mihail. These moments are often bittersweet, as the characters do stop the Nemesis from advancing, but you know these deaths are often in vain, as he'll just return later. Halfway through the game, Jill also calls a chopper to get her out of the city. Despite the game portraying this as the end, with a slideshow of credits not too far behind, the Nemesis shows up and blows it out of the sky. And this is on top of the many times he just comes back. You blow him up, dump acid on him, and even shoot him with a laser gun, and yet he still comes back. It's as if his singular goal of killing the stars is so pronounced that he's too determined to die. It makes each fight feel exhausting. As the game continues and his appearances start racking up in the double digits, you start to wonder if there's really any hope left, that if defeat is even possible at this stage. Even when you finally kill him at the end of the game by shooting a giant laser at him, just as you leave, the parasite slowly stumbles towards you. It will die not long after this, but I can imagine most players are ready to throw their hands up in awe at this stage, utterly convinced that he could not die. So the Nemesis is not only draining your resources and any options you have, but also your sanity. He's not locked in here with you, you're locked in here with him. It's his arena and his playground. You're just living in it, and he does not like visitors. With this in mind, it's no wonder Nemesis became the subtitle of the game. It's incredibly telling that promo art for him in various magazines shows him holding the corpse of Brad. They wanted you to feel like he really was your nemesis, that you were powerless to stop him. That you'd be forced to watch while you pepper him with bullets and yet stands there without a scratch while he continues to ruin every one of your plans along the way. A constant threat that never leaves you, even after you quit the game. Shinji Mikami stated that he wanted to make the nemesis so as to introduce a new feeling of fear within the player, the fear that they are being stalked at all times. Well, I can say with certainty that they nailed it, as while the nemesis definitely didn't like me, I loved him, as he's by far the best part of this game. But to make the nemesis appear as threatening as he is in-game, he's going to need more characters to hunt down besides Jill. Most of the STARS members are out of the question, so RE3 ramps up the stakes by having Jill run into Umbrella's own forces. The Umbrella Biohazard Countermeasure Service, or UBCS, is an armed force created by Umbrella specifically for biohazard containment. This is not to be confused with the other Umbrella soldiers like the ones who attacked Birkin. These guys are mercenaries, most often criminals who are given a second life in exchange for joining the force. Their jobs are kept under lock and key most times, as they mostly deal with illegal products, so their existence isn't known by many. The group also has a high mortality rate, as while they are briefed on what to expect, seeing and hearing are two different things. UBCS teams are told to take out any infected they find and rescue survivors when necessary, although Umbrella staff and those affiliated with the company were given higher priority. But the few memos and diaries left behind detail the final moments of some of these men, who more often than not took their own lives, believing that leaving this existence was better than staying here in the city. The opening scene and a few other notes show us that they were not only unsuccessful, most are wiped out within a few hours of landing in the city. While RE1 and 2 focus on the new strains of the virus and the ensuing outbreaks that occurred from their use, RE3 wants to take a different look at one we're already familiar with. So rather than waste time re-explaining the T or G virus, RE3's files give us glimpses into the personal lives of the people here in Raccoon City. A director at the hospital writes in his notes how he has seen more people arrive with this so-called cannibal disease. He upholds that he will figure out what is going on as he is a doctor and it's his job to save people. But as more patients pile in, he loses more sleep and even more hope. Martial law and a military blockade was also put around the city to stop this cannibal disease. Further, notes in the environment also shows that Umbrella was hiding in plain sight, using front companies as a way to hide their real locations underground. This is something we've been intimately familiar with, but RE3 expands on this a bit more, by implying that they may have bought the mayor as well. Umbrella practically runs the entire city. Staff were told that because of this, civilians may accidentally stumble into the labs. If so, they were to be arrested and taken to the lab to be guinea pigs for the experiments. Evidence also suggests that they were watching over the events from behind their monitors and observation stations. A few of the notes we collect in-game contain info that could have only been obtained recently. It's another example that reinforces the game's willingness to move the plot on without your presence, but it also shows that while the outbreak was happening, Umbrella was sitting back and recording data. There is a real sinister dissonance seeing the clean break rooms where they relaxed, kicked up their feet and conversed while people were outside dying. Umbrella has always been a sinister company, but there's levels to their evil, and RE3 is certainly ramping that up. Back to the soldiers, some of those within the units were considered supervisors. Supervisors were briefed on the real mission, while others were just on a need-to-know basis. Supervisors were to obtain samples of information pertaining to the outbreak, and record combat data of the UBCS as they fought the zombies. They were also told to destroy any evidence in the medical facility to hide Umbrella's involvement, and it's here where our story takes us. As while trying to escape the city, Jill meets with a few members of the UBCS, Nikolai, Mikhail, and Carlos. Nikolai is a supervisor and knows more than he is letting on. He's against Jill joining the group, likely because he's aware of the Nemesis and its sole mission to hunt down stars, thus it would bring them in conflict with the Nemesis by having Jill with them. Nikolai can also be seen killing other UBCS soldiers. Now, due to the live selection system, this sometimes isn't Nikolai. This first scene with the soon-to-be infected Murphy actually swaps Nikolai with Carlos depending on some earlier choices. But when he does show up in these live selections, Nikolai expresses very little concern for the others' well-being, viewing their conditions rather pragmatically. Nikolai does eventually confess to the whole ordeal, but he also further states that he was also here to kill all the other supervisors, in an effort to be the only one remaining, as that would give him more bargaining power when he talks to Umbrella about the attack. He also planned to take out Jill later to get a nice little bonus on top of his large pay cut, although depending on the choices, he will either die to the Nemesis, die to Jill, or flee with the last chopper out of the city. He is by far the best character of the supporting cast, a truly evil man who is only looking to exploit others in order to get ahead. Seems he and Umbrella have something in common. Mikhail and Carlos are a step below, but still good. The thing about Mikhail and Carlos is that Jill does not trust them, since they work for Umbrella. Part of the journey here is learning to trust them more, as Jill realizes that they're just soldiers taking orders, not Umbrella. But Mikhail only appears twice, once at the beginning when you first meet, and another during an optional encounter. He was injured prior to Jill's arrival, so he's mainly rested in the nearby cable car. His star-studded moment is giving up his life by blowing up the Nemesis in the other cable car as they all try to flee. But there is a semblance of a personality within him. When you first meet, he's screaming about the zombies and asking his men to fire. He's already got PTSD from the attack. Later, we could see him fighting off another group of zombies before collapsing. His injuries have gotten the better of him, but he doesn't want to be dead weight. He wants to be of use to his team, so he's trying to make himself feel useful. It's an interesting start and in a way carries over to his self-sacrifice, but with so little screen time, I find it hard to connect with him. Carlos does at least make a few more appearances in the script, but he mainly just talks to Jill about their escape plan. Unfortunately, his role is a lot like Barry or Rebecca's from RE1. At the very least, Carlos does also show some personality too, like when he has to put down Murphy and you can tell that he's struggling to deal with all this death, or his most notable moment, which is when he has to save Jill after a fight with the Nemesis. Jill gets infected, so Carlos needs to make a vaccine. The game then switches perspectives as you play as Carlos. When not escaping, Carlos basically flirts with Jill, and it's a really hard watch given Jill has zero interest in him whatsoever. Overall, they aren't a terrible cast. I just think I would have liked to see a bit more interactions with them, especially with Carlos and Mikhail. It's just a night and day difference when you go from the conversations with Ada and Sherry to these guys. There was a lot of personality in them. It actually made me feel things. I just didn't really feel all that much for the RE3 cast. Returning to the story, after being cured thanks to Carlos, both he and Jill learn that the US Army plans to nuke the place by morning, so Carlos and Jill have very little time to escape. Jill then has to make another live selection, which specifically determines your ending. Jill is ambushed by the Nemesis. Pushing him off or jumping off leads to two unique endings. In one, Nikolai is killed by the Nemesis, which leaves a chopper behind for Carlos and Jill to take, or Nikolai commandeers the last chopper. Regardless of if Jill shoots him down or negotiates, he still steals the last one. But that's when the game pulls a rabbit out of its ass and has Barry Burton appear out of nowhere to rescue Jill. Little strange to include this since it's never set up and comes out of nowhere, but I cannot deny that seeing Barry rescue Jill reminded me of the partnership they had in RE1, which with that context in mind, makes the ending much more rewarding. But to get to the chopper, Jill has to square off against the Nemesis a few more times. This leads to a brief encounter where she has to spill acid on its body, which initially seems to be the killing blow until it's found later mutating out of a corpse. This area also contains many dead tyrants and US Army soldiers, reinforcing that the US Army is on the move, and that Umbrella deployed multiple tyrants to the city, something we saw in RE2. No matter what happens, Carlos, Jill, and possibly Barry escape the city just as the US Army launches a missile that takes out all of Raccoon City, quite literally wiping it off the map, bringing down the curtain on the Raccoon City trilogy and its role in Resident Evil. Resident Evil 3 is a hard game to talk about, because I do enjoy it, but I also think it's one of my least favorites in this early era in the franchise. When talking with Edge magazine, Shinji Mikami said that RE2 was for the mass market, while RE3 was for the hardcore gamers, the ones who like action games. At the time, it was an attempt to ramp up the action and send off Raccoon City in a beautiful firework, literally and figuratively. Nowadays, it could also be seen as a sign of the times. The games have had more focus on action, and this will continue quite deep into the second era of the franchise, one that was literally defined by its action. I think that's why I feel less interested in Resident Evil 3 compared to some of the other games, because I always fall back on that survival horror style that made the franchise great. Call me stuck in my ways, but I like when Resident Evil sticks to horror. It's created some of the best games in the franchise when it sticks to that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that Resident Evil 3 is bad by any means. I think the Raccoon City trilogy is one of the franchise's strongest stories. It's such a pivotal part of the game's history, it's the origin story for most of the game's cast, and it's something that continues to haunt them as they continue throughout the timeline. From the Arklay Mountains to Raccoon City itself, these three games are solid in their own way. But with Raccoon City quite literally behind us, there is only one place left to go. The end of Resident Evil 3 gave us a few details on the characters of the trilogy and where they went. Jill continued to search for Chris, Barry wants to make up for his betrayal back in RE1, Sherry was taken by the US government and brought into protective custody, while Leon was basically coerced into joining a new organization within the government in exchange for his silence involving the Outbreak and Sherry's life. Ada reflects on her life and the scars she earned, likely from Mr. X, before putting her feelings aside and getting ready for the next mission, while Hunk survived and escaped the Outbreak, that's why he was called the fourth survivor. All the threads have been tied up, save for one. Chris is on his way to Europe, and Claire went there to find him. Umbrella schemes have gone on long enough, so it's time to head to Umbrella's HQ in Europe and finally end this thing. Code Veronica begins by immediately throwing all that out the window. Over the past 3 months, Claire has been looking into Umbrella. She made it to the company's Paris facility and has been trespassing there for over 10 days. Umbrella had caught wind of her presence and apprehended her, although not without a fight. Claire refused to be caught by Umbrella as she was this close to finding her brother, but she couldn't possibly think of taking on an entire army alone. She was then taken into custody and brought to a place called Rockford Island. But as she gets situated into her new home, a fight can be heard outside. The entire prison complex has been overrun by zombies. This is when the main objective comes into view: escape Rockford Island. So what the hell happened to Europe? Not to skip ahead, but hilariously this gets even stranger. Claire came here to find Chris, whereas now Chris actually comes to Rockford Island later to find Claire after learning she was taken prisoner. Funnier, the very final line in the game is Chris telling Claire that this fight is far from over, and that now it's finally time to take down Umbrella once and for all. My guy, that was supposed to be your job. This was the game you were supposed to do that in. I mean, this whole game seemed like it was setting up this climactic end to the saga that's been building for the past 3 games, so why the bait and switch? I think hindsight also makes me feel worse about this writing decision. I can't find any info online that suggests why this storyline was altered. I can only imagine it was because they wanted to print more games. Umbrella going away would cut a significant thread from the story, so Capcom is likely trying to delay that as much as possible. And yet, they've already done that. Looking ahead to the future, Umbrella is actually going to go into decline after their schemes of Raccoon City are exposed. Although in its wake, groups like Neo Umbrella in RE6 or the PMC Umbrella in RE7 have been formed, so it's clear that Capcom is still being influenced by its own creations. Which makes it all the more confusing why this wasn't the climactic finish it should have been. I think it's a part of a growing infection that plagues Resident Evil. It's by far one of the worst things about this franchise, where it refuses to elaborate or successfully conclude anything it creates. Back to the previous games, Resident Evil 6's villain is involved in an organization called the Family. The main character's wife in RE7 is a part of a group called the Connections. None of these are elaborated on or concluded in a way that feels satisfying. It's just on to the next big thing. Ada, after 5 games, 2 of which recontextualize her old appearances, 2 remakes that give her more screen time, and a movie, is still just a spy, with the audience having little to no understanding of who she is, who she works for, and why. It's a consistent theme amongst Resident Evil media, likely because it gives the devs lots of opportunities, threads to hang back on in case they want to revisit something. But after a while, it seems less like a future-proofing strategy and more of a flaw, where the teams continue to make things up with the intent on never coming back to them again, as they just want to focus on the new virus and the returning cast. It's why I look back on Code Veronica with even more confusion, because it feels like the first stage of the franchise's own deadly virus. To have this story be built up as Chris taking down Umbrella, and then not have him do that, vow to take them down again at the end of this game, and then also not follow up on that, is really shitty. But there is no use crying over spilled viruses, they say. It's clear that the team had something more interesting in mind for this game, so rather than lament on what could have been, we gotta look at what was. Code Veronica is split into 2 stories, involving Chris and Claire. Unlike previous games, these playthroughs are synced together. No A or B playthroughs and no RE1 overlap. You flip between Chris and Claire a few times throughout the story at certain pivotal points in the game. Claire is the one who gets the most screen time, although in classic Resident Evil fashion, Chris gets all the glory. The game is also split into 2 maps, Rockford Island, where Claire is right now, and an Antarctic base she'll visit later. This creates a kind of unique dynamic where items and events can be passed to the other character, much like Resident Evil 2, although a bit more seamless. One that's certain to give Code Veronica players flashbacks because of how random it was. If you store an empty fire extinguisher in an item box when playing as Claire, Chris can refill it and retrieve a Magnum in a later level. But some lesser known changes occur in other ways. When Claire fights Nosferatu, if she doesn't take any poison damage, Chris won't have to get a serum when he finds her, otherwise it's a quick trip downstairs. She'll also have different dialogue depending on certain factors, like if she killed it with a sniper rifle or a knife. It gives a bit of a personal touch to a playthrough, and while it doesn't necessarily encourage replayability, it does enhance it. Code Veronica also shakes things up by stepping away from the American city streets and corporate office buildings and instead uses European architecture with some gothic touches. Although mainly in the first map, as the Antarctic base is much more aligned with the corporate style from past games. It shows a delineation between this game and the others, serving as a transition piece between the Raccoon City days and this new direction for the franchise. But with this much content on offer, it's no wonder that the game was bundled on 2 discs initially. Compared to some future games, it's of similar length, but here in this early era, it easily ranks amongst one of the longest games you'll play through. Thing is, with length comes a greater focus on retention. The longer something becomes, the more priority needs to be placed on keeping people engaged. If you're going to ask the player to play for longer, there ought to be a good reason to do so, otherwise to me it just feels like padding. Claire's story is a great example, as you could easily cut this in half and nothing would be lost. Most of Claire's story provides some context as the state of the facility and introduces the new cast. But it's also mainly about escaping Rockford Island, and it takes quite a while for any of that to actually happen. It's not that I need something every 4 seconds in order to feel stimulation in my brain, I just like to feel like I'm working towards something meaningful. Much of this first disc is functionally irrelevant, and that goes for most of the dialogue as well. While working to escape the island, Claire comes across Alfred Ashford, the new main villain, and back from the dead, Albert Wesker. Despite his status in the franchise, Wesker is little more than a side character, one who only makes a brief appearance, just short enough to question why he was here in the first place. What's funny is that his role in Code Veronica was even less relevant when it was first released. Code Veronica got an updated version for the PS2 called Code Veronica X. This added some extra scenes and dialogue to flesh out the story more. There was a whole showdown between him and Chris at the end of the game that's completely absent from the original release. I'm glad that these were included, but as I've often said, it's a band-aid over a bullet wound. Even with all these extra scenes, Wesker's presence is nothing more than a confusing callback to the original. But Wesker's role in the story makes much more sense when you look into the future. It's thanks to his actions involving a character named Steve and the beef he has with Chris that sets up the next few games. So Code Veronica's story often works best as a transitory piece, setting up plot elements for later games to pick from. But if we leave that behind for just a second and look at this as a singular entry, you can see how little he actually matters. At least Wesker and RE1 had purpose and reason. All this Wesker does is taunt Chris, claim to want him dead, yet never kill him, and then only succeed in his goal of achieving a sample of this game's virus through a loophole. He only shows up once during the entirety of Disc 1, which only serves to introduce him and give him a chance to flex his new powers. I'd say that his presence is entirely forgettable in this game, but as I said before, it's hard to go from his role in RE1 to where he ends up in the future without this game serving as the foundation. I guess what really bothers me at the end of the day is that we spend so little time with him in Claire's story, and instead spent more of that time with Steve. Not long after escaping her prison cell, Claire runs into Steve, a prisoner here on the island. Steve is meant to serve as this kind of immature, inexperienced teenager, as he comes off as extremely annoying and sometimes creepy. He plays the tough guy a lot, and quite literally acts like her knight at times. He's got such a teenage mindset to him that while I absolutely hate it, I can at least understand him. He's fascinated by these shiny gold pistols that he almost gets himself killed over it. Then when Claire saves him, he refused to give them up to her. There is another moment later where Claire is attacked by a new zombie type but is saved by Steve, who jumps through a window with those same dual Lugers and guns the beast down, all while sprinkling in some poses for good measure. His insistence on showing up all the time to save her and look cool while doing it obviously tells us that Steve is attracted to her and is trying to show off. He stares at her too long when moving a crane that he loses control and causes a gas leak. Steve will also, although this is quite creepy, try to sneak a kiss in when she's asleep. Steve's like an action hero, you know, the one who saves the day and gets the girl, all those old tropes, except he's a whiny kid who tries to save a girl who more often than not saves herself and him, and one who also doesn't relate any of the same kind of feelings that he has for her. I'm assuming Steve was intentionally designed this way so that you would feel put off by his presence. Claire seems to feel the same way. Despite his heroic feats, she rarely ever acknowledges him. An absolute all-timer is when Steve vows to help clear a path ahead so that she isn't harmed. Firstly, this is like the Resident Evil equivalent of rolling out the red carpet, in that Claire is too precious and beautiful to have the zombies interrupting her or infecting the ground she walks on. So Steve, her knight in shining armor, will make sure she's not disturbed. But Claire merely tolerates this act because it means less zombies for her to kill. However, if you go back to where she is sitting, she tells Steve to go back out there, and his slow turn with no dialogue makes it feel like he's a kid getting dismissed by his mother and told to go back to his room.
What's wrong? Cold feet?
So even Claire is barely entertaining his heroism, just casually accepting it so they can move on. And so if Claire's not interested, neither am I. But all of this is meant to change when he gets his backstory revealed. After falling to the floor below, Steve and Claire are attacked by a single zombie. While there should be no problem for Mr. Knight in shining armor with his dual guns, he struggles. It's learned that this is his father, now a zombie, ready to bite down on the girl he loves. So despite it all, once again, he saves Claire. Steve reveals that his father used to work for Umbrella, but then he tried to steal some research from them. He wanted to sell it to someone else, but the company found out. So they had his wife killed and he and Steve were sent to this prison. I do feel bad for Steve after hearing this. It connects to how he is unwilling to confront his own emotions, storming off whenever Claire asks him about it. The kid doesn't know how to cope with the situation. It's why he has this line where he says, quote, "Guns are more reliable than people." A precise look at his mindset after having been in prison for so long. In here, you can't rely on other people, only yourself, and a gun can't betray you like a human does. But when Claire asks about this, questioning how that's even possible, Steve refuses to elaborate. That's when the backstory follows, and now things start to make more sense. The rest of the story continues with these two working together to escape the island. Disc 1 eventually ends with the two of them actually escaping, only to be forced to fly into an Antarctic base that is owned by the Ashfords. From here, it's once again another lengthy process of escaping. There are lots of important lore details revealed here and the start of Chris's story, but I'll cover that soon. The way Code Veronica caps off Claire's story in this game is with Steve once more. The two try to escape from Antarctica but are attacked by Alexia Ashford. The screen goes black as we're left to question what happened. Next we see them, it's as Chris where Claire gets stuck in some goop while Steve was taken to be experimented on. Not of sound mind thanks to the virus, he attacks Claire with reckless abandon, but just as he is about to deliver the killing blow, he stops. It's not long after that he leaves this world, but not before confessing his love to Claire. Honestly, I slowly started to come around to Steve after a while. His final moments were the highlight of his character. In an earlier fight, he vowed to protect Claire next time she's in danger. He claims he failed, but through sheer will, he was able to fight the virus and save her, even if it was from himself. He's also someone who lost the meaning of reliability, only finding it in objects and items, things that can give him an edge, but he found that reliability again in Claire. But his voice and personality were quite grating at times. I can understand wanting Claire to go back to her motherly role again like she did with Sherry, but I do feel as though time could have been better spent discussing the Ashfords or Wesker. So I'll be honest and say that while I didn't mind Steve, I'm glad he didn't become a reoccurring character in this franchise. I think one Steve was enough for me. Altogether, Claire's section is rather strange from a pacing perspective. As I stated earlier, Claire's segment really could have just been cut in half, and I don't feel as though anything could have been lost. Of course, it's always important to remember that Code Veronica is a game, and so the gameplay will fundamentally be of higher priority, but there is a rather unfortunate imbalance between how much of the content in this game feels like running around doing busy work versus something actually meaningful. Puzzles and gameplay are fine, but I like to feel as though I'm moving with purpose. A position many often hold for this game is that Code Veronica has too much backtracking. I personally agree with the sentiment, as while backtracking itself is not the issue, the distance you have to travel just to get some random key item makes these already long stretches between meaningful story moments even longer. But taken merely as a part of the story rather than a separate one, it starts to make a bit more narrative sense, because the introductory feel that makes up most of Claire's story seems to be intentional, so that Chris's story can provide some answers. As outlined by Capcom themselves, previous Resident Evil games focused on the zombies, monsters, and a shadowy organization. Code Veronica then focuses on the madness of man and the fate of a noble bloodline. It's a much more personal tale this time, although it still finds a way to connect to the broader franchise. The villains behind this game are an aristocratic family known as the Ashfords. It started with their founder Veronica Ashford and has continued since. The fifth head further down the family tree is Edward Ashford. Edward was, along with Oswald Spencer, one of the co-founders of Umbrella. Spencer was the owner of the mansion in RE1, a detail that wouldn't be revealed until the remake, which we'll discuss shortly. The two men had met, and it was not long after that Edward found the progenitor virus. As the name suggests, it was the origin of all the viruses. RE5 tells us that it was found in Africa and is millions of years old. When Edward and Spencer first found this, they became interested in using it for militaristic purposes. Through this, they created a variation of the progenitor virus called the T-virus. But as we saw from RE2, Birkin had his own strain of T-virus in his lab, so it's assumed that the Ashfords were working on their own T-virus research. And this actually connects well to the rest of the series and this next part in our story. See, it was because of this discovery that led them to creating Umbrella to camouflage their research. However, Edward had died during the project, leaving his son Alexander as the next in line. The issue is that Alexander was a biogeneticist, so he dealt with DNA and such. He was not a virologist, someone who studies viruses, so he was ill-equipped to take on this project. Worse, because of the growing competition in T-virus research, he feared that others would use the death of Edward to their advantage, believing that Spencer would soon usurp control of Umbrella from him. So using the background of science that he's familiar with, he came up with a plan. Firstly, he moved to a new base in the Antarctic. He also had his lab built like his old mansion, a design of the late George Trevor. Trevor is also an RE1 Remake exclusive character that was the designer behind the mansion in the first game. This explains why the main hall looks the same, while also segueing neatly into the next game when we revisit the Spencer mansion again and talk about the Trevors. Once this was established, he would begin work on an experiment that would hopefully restore the Great Ashford name that he soiled with his incompetence. He named the project after the first member of the family, Veronica. You know the game's getting serious when it uses the title in-game. The Veronica project involved Alexander combining the DNA of Veronica Ashford with some manipulated genes to create a being of high intelligence. After implanting this inside a surrogate mother, Alexander had unexpectedly birthed twins, Alfred and Alexia Ashford. Alfred was intelligent, but not what he was looking for. Alexia, on the other hand, was a child prodigy, becoming a chief researcher at Umbrella at just the age of 10. All he had to do was raise Alexia right, and she would be able to bring glory to the Ashford name. But the twins had other plans. While their younger life is a mystery, we can see that they became obsessed with dragonfly and ant imagery. Lots of doors, locks, keys, and symbols within their manor have them. This likely stems from Alexia's interest in ants. Alexia finds the ant ecosystem interesting. Typically, ants are ruled over by a queen. Worker and soldier ants all work together to protect and feed her. If they die, they could be replaced, but if a queen is dead, the hive dies with it. This eternal servitude to a queen is where her fascination stems from. While working to become the child prodigy that Alexander had in mind, Alexia soon discovered the remains of an ancient virus inside an ant queen. Combining the progenitor virus with this new strain, she created the T-Veronica virus. Alexia wanted to enhance her own power without succumbing to the effects of the virus, which without precaution would melt her cells and body, as it did their father. See, Alexander had hid the details of the twins' birth behind a locked door within the facility. Alfred was the first to find this door. After telling Alexia, the twins felt betrayed by their father. So seeing as he wasn't exactly a worthy member of the Ashford title, and the twins were experimenting with the T. Veronica virus, they felt that Alexander would be a great human test subject. Alexia's experiments failed on him, but she expected them to. She cared very little for her father, and thus why he was chosen as a test subject. However, rather than kill him, she locked him down beneath the lab and strapped him to a chair. This creature, the Nosferatu, is what remains of her father. As her work progressed, she realized that the only way for this to work is to suppress the activity of the virus by freezing it at an ultra-low temperature, so that her cells could change at a much slower, more manageable rate. She believed that 15 years would suffice, so she stepped inside and stayed locked in this tube for that long. In the meantime, Alfred was running things. But this is when Alfred would start to lose it. He lost his father and sister in such a short amount of time, on top of being forced to run things while she was away. It took a major toll on his psyche, so much so that he developed a completely different personality from it. He started dressing up and talking like Alexia, wearing a wig and makeup to boot. Old film from their childhood implies that they were both very close. The rooms were also decorated the same, minus the color palette. Alfred was very much like his sister and had lots of love for her, so to be alone without her crushed him, which would led him to becoming her to cope. During the 15-year wait, Alfred would run things with some success, although what was for certain is that he was ruthless in his methods. He, like his sister, saw anyone who wasn't of royal blood as beneath them. Commoners, unwashed, unworthy folk who were even lucky to be working here. The prison camp itself seems to be an Alfred trademark creation. Diaries around the camp suggest that spies and traitors to Umbrella were taken here and experimented on with no intent of being freed. One person was an attendant at the palace but was sent here over a simple mistake he had made, which, assuming the notes are connected, may be because he asked about Alexia's presence. But the island also doubled as a training ground for the future Umbrella soldiers, a place that Hunk actually used to call home. Not long after Claire gets thrown in jail though, the attack begins. Wesker is now part of a rival company called the HCF. They're looking for the T. Veronica virus so they can outdo Umbrella, and Wesker's helping lead the charge. They may have also been behind the leaking of the T virus here, which caused the zombies and the outbreak. All of this then brings us back to when Claire awoke in her prison cell. This is quite literally more lore than we have ever had for a Resident Evil title so far. Its willingness to also put so much emphasis on the story is a first for the franchise. There are so many details in these games that the previous ones don't elaborate on. I mean, it's not until the next game when we learn about who the hell the mansion actually belonged to. Code Veronica shows a deliberate shift towards more meaningful storytelling, a shift that the franchise will continue to carry even now, as developers across the industry started putting more thought into the stories that accompanied their games. It all wraps up by the end when Chris gets introduced into the story. While escaping the Arctic base, Alfred, who previously fell down a massive hole, uses his last remaining strength to awaken Alexia. There she comforts her brother in his final moments and then begins her quest to rule the world as the queen she wanted to be, starting by destroying Claire and Steve's truck. During this time, having received a message from Leon thanks to an email from Claire, Chris goes to Rockford Island to find her. It's a great example of the sheer amount of padding this game has as you spend the next 2 hours or so going through the same locations you've already visited. The trip to Rockford Island is especially useless as Chris leaves to go to Antarctica anyway since Claire and Steve already left. Chris then finds Claire but they have to split up. Claire deals with Steve and is subsequently captured. Chris goes on ahead and deals with Alexia, who's mutated into her ant body. I think the symbolism is rather interesting here, as her final form is that of a dragonfly. Or, well, a mutated one, at least. We saw how utterly helpless the dragonfly was to her ants in a cutscene. Alexia wanted to be the queen ant, but her last form was that of a dragonfly, one whose wings were clipped by Chris. As Chris and Claire escape the facility before this one blows up in the classic self-destruct sequence, Chris is stopped by Wesker. Having been unsuccessful in fighting Alexia before, he decided to find Steve's corpse, who, thanks to Alexia's experimentation, still has trace amounts of T. Veronica in him. So in a way he got what he wanted. But neither of them plan to leave this place with the other still alive, so the two battle in what is admittedly a pretty cool scene for an in-game animated fight from the year 2000. But Code Veronica, as we've seen, is a game about setting up conflict, not solving it, so this is merely to establish their rivalry for the next game. Chris and Claire then head into a jet and take off before the base explodes, followed by Chris proclaiming that he will now work to take down Umbrella, a claim that he will once again never fulfill. Code Veronica is a pretty solid game. I still think I prefer some of the other games in the series, but there is a lot of love here. I'm still very annoyed that Capcom set up this whole endgame conflict only to pull the rug out from under the player, but I do admit that the story we did receive was at least good. Steve is likable, sort of, but I didn't find him to be incredibly interesting as some of the other game's side characters. And while the conflict between Chris and Wesker isn't exactly exciting, it's at least worth playing the game to get wrapped up in the story with the Ashfords. But all that circles back to my main gripe with Code Veronica. The story of the Ashfords is great and a nice twist, and its most notable addition, Wesker and what he does with Steve's corpse, transitions neatly into the next few entries. It's great. Amazing, even. So long as you're willing to wait a few hours before any of it starts to actually get to that point, while you wander around aimlessly, looking for more keys to fit into locks. It's around here where the story of Resident Evil as a game franchise starts to plateau. Its own creations had cornered it, and Resident Evil was slowly running out of ammo. These next few games loop us back around to the beginning of our story as we revisit familiar locations again under new circumstances. But that wasn't to say they were bad games for doing so. In 2001, Nintendo revealed its newest console, the GameCube. Eager to bring Resident Evil to even more audiences, Capcom eventually ported the previous Resident Evil games over to the GameCube. The only one that didn't make the cut was the first Resident Evil game, as that was given special attention. It would be the first remake for the series and was released in 2002. Strangely, this is not the first time Resident Evil 1 has been remade in a sense. As I mentioned earlier, RE1's director's cut came about in 1997 as a response to the delay of RE2. This added a few new difficulty modes like beginner and arrange mode to keep things fresh. Next year in 1998, they released the game with DualShock support as Sony had released their DualShock controller. This version is infamous for its soundtrack. Everyone knows the iconic basement theme, but in case you haven't heard it, well, I'm sorry. I wish I could say that was the last time Resident Evil was altered, but it got some further iterations in 2006, where it was called Deadly Silence for the DS. This is sort of like the original game, but it uses the DS stylus for certain actions like first-person knife fights. Dialing it back a bit though, we need only stop at 2002, as that's when the remake we're actually going to talk about was released for the GameCube. And it's arguably the best version of RE1, period. There's a reason Capcom never remade RE1 again when all those other games were getting their dues, because they already made it 20 years ago, and it rocks. The game's plot begins in much the same way as the original. Alpha Team arrives looking for Bravo Team, only to be ambushed by the undead. Something I really like about this intro is how it reinforces just how green some of these guys are. They never faced something like this before, so they should be terrified by what they're seeing. Jill is noticeably shaken up after seeing Joseph get mauled to death. Later, when a zombie attacks Jill, she stomps its head in, but she has to throw up afterwards. It's important to remember that they are seeing a living, walking corpse with rotting flesh. It's a pretty valid reaction. I also like how the game subverts a few classic moments to keep older fans on their toes. When Jill grabs her grenade launcher, rather than being ambushed by birds, Forrest, the guy who previously owned it, will attack her. The remake even punishes players who remember too much. The tiger statue used to require a red and blue gemstone. The remake now swaps the red for a yellow. The red gemstone is used for another puzzle, but if you use it on the statue, snakes will come down from the ceiling. They also made it so one of the go-to safe rooms has a nearby doorknob that breaks after a few uses, requiring you to go around if you want to use the save room. And if you try to leave the mansion, the game also adds a new scene where a dog hops through and attacks you in the main foyer. This is one of those really unnecessary but welcome touches, because you know the place is surrounded by dogs anyway, but the remake really wants to make sure you understand that. There are also a few times when a game would swap to the FMVs just like in the original, although these have been slightly redesigned to give it a sort of found footage look to it. Richard, if saved, will also save Chris or Jill from an attack and even help Jill fight the giant snake, giving him a much greater purpose than the original. Chris also expresses disappointment in himself for not being able to save Richard. Had he just been more careful, Richard would have not needed to jump in front of the shark. Rebecca also steers the conversation away from this, which seems a little bit odd. Lets you check up on her, and then she starts to break down over seeing another one of her team dead. One of the old rooms in the original also housed a file you could read for some more lore. This now has a cutscene where Barry and Jill talk about the file and what they've experienced so far. Barry can also be found in one of the rooms where Plan 42 is, presumably talking to himself about Wesker's deal. We then later see Barry take an elevator which leaves Jill trapped in the underground. All of this is meant to foreshadow his reluctant betrayal, before coming to a head where you have to choose between letting Barry keep his gun or not during a fight against Lisa Trevor. This choice can make Barry more likely to be killed during this and lock you out of the best ending. Wesker even has a new line where he mentions Barry's flakiness to Jill, likely in an attempt to make Wesker not seem like the bad guy. You can also tell when set side by side how much the original color palette has changed, becoming more muted. The team did this to make the mansion more horrifying while using the contrast of light and dark to make enemies harder to see. The fixed camera perspective still exists, but I find it much more cinematic in this game than in the original. It's not really something I can prove definitively, but there was definitely a vibe shift that occurred when I played this. I noticed more low-angle shots, or ones that linger for far longer than they should. The team seems to have crafted a more cinematic-looking game through these occasional shots. And by also putting the cameras at different directions than you're used to, it contributes to a consistent feeling of being lost despite running through the same manner. Which segues neatly into a comment about the horror, as despite being the same exact mansion seen from different angles, the game is way more terrifying than ever thanks to these shots. There is nothing like walking forward only for the camera to switch to show a large spider on the wall, especially when the room over has just enough range to show around the corner. That was easily one of the most terrifying sequences I have ever taken part in. Overall, quite a bit has changed, but it still has that Resident Evil 1 feeling. It's like 90% of the original experience with some added bonuses that don't detract from the original vision in any way. If anything, they actually enhance it. And speaking of which, the biggest change to the remake comes not from the gameplay, but from the story. In an effort to flesh things out and connect things better, RE1 Remake expands and even adds new lore to the game. Many of the old notes like the itchy, tasty ones still appear, but a few notable changes were made. Firstly, it removes mention of a white umbrella from the original files, as white umbrella does not exist and it was likely a localization error. It also finally brings Oswald Spencer into the fold. Oswald Spencer is one of the main antagonists in the series. He's the owner of this mansion and was one of the first people to start Umbrella. The original never mentions him by name, although reports suggest that they did plan to, but it was cut before release. Wesker also has a note that's from William Birkin, who talks about how he created the G virus from the progenitor virus, and how the G virus will surpass the T virus. Even mentioning how he plans to show off his valuable research to Alexia Ashford, who will likely be quite pissed to see how far he's advanced his research compared to her own. This creates even greater continuity with the rest of the franchise. The remake also adds in some new subplots via the in-game notes and cutscenes that are quite good. There's a note titled Suicide Note, which explains itself, but I like how in this exact same room there is a zombie who was hanged, implying that this is the man that took his own life because of the T virus, but it continued to infect him even after death. It also makes note of a Robert that the writer had to lock in the bathroom. The two were escaping zombies, but Robert was showing signs of infection, so he had to be put down. This explains why there's a corpse in the bathroom, and why there is a self-defense gun on the table missing a round. It's like its own little story, all from just a single note and some environmental storytelling. The next mentions the existence of the Crimson Heads. Lore-wise, these researchers down here in the labs observe that after the host loses consciousness, the body goes into a dormant state. During this time, the T-virus takes over and begins to transform and reconstruct the body. After the procedure, the subject would experience faster speed and more muscular development on top of more innate aggression. The Crimson Head was deemed too dangerous as it had already killed 4 researchers before this, but not wanting to give up such a perfect specimen, they locked it in a coffin, which you have to open to progress. This description is more than just flavor text, it's a part of the remake's new mechanical depth. Killing a zombie in this game now leaves the body on the ground. After a certain amount of time, these zombies can randomly come back as Crimson Heads. To prevent this, you have to burn the body so that they can't mutate. Like a classic survival horror game, it's about which zombies need to be burned and which can be left alone. You can of course sidestep the whole mechanic altogether by not killing any of the zombies, but then that comes at the risk of letting them wander the mansion. The last but most important subplot comes in the form of a new character, Lisa Trevor. The Trevor family was one of presumably many people experimented on here in the Arklay Mountains. RE1 takes place in 1998, but Lisa's journal entries date back to the 60s. Each of them was given shots of the progenitor virus. Lisa seems to have gone mad as she can't find her mom. She finds her later, but she says that it's not her face. The note seems to suggest that Lisa found her mom when she had already died. She then later attached her mom and her dad's face to her as well so that they could be together forever. Down underground near a cabin is a small set of rooms that belong to Lisa. There are a few images of a young girl, likely Lisa before she was tested on. She also has lots of dolls down here, likely an attempt to create a family she no longer has. It all comes to a head in a final confrontation with her, where you have to remove 4 stone pillars that seal her mother's body in the coffin. Once open, she takes her mother's head, cradles it, and jumps into the pits below. Other notes found throughout the mansion are from the parents. Jessica, the mother, wrote some notes to Lisa talking about the shots they were giving her, expressing worry that she is starting to lose her memories and worry that she may forget Lisa in time. George's diaries make note of how he helped design this mansion, including the puzzles, but George was unaware, at least not until much later, that his family would be a part of the test subjects. See, George and Spencer were the only ones who knew of the mansion's true purpose, so he was going to be killed so that the secret remained as such, while his wife and daughter would be used as test subjects for their virus testing. He then tried to escape the mansion but found himself lost in his own puzzles as his memory continued to fade. Eventually, he stumbled upon a hole and fell in. Inside, it was a grave titled George Trevor. They had dug him an early grave in preparation for his death. The Trevor family notes are some of the most disturbing content in Resident Evil. We know the horrors of this place and the future horrors yet to come in this timeline, but hearing these personal stories and then seeing these very same people creates a very disturbing connection. It's as if the pages have come to life. That simple "I miss you" hurts, man. The family didn't deserve that, most of all Lisa, who after 30 years is still here looking for her mother. I wish I could say that her death at the end of the boss fight was a mercy, a way to free her from these shackles that still bind her hands, but given some information we'll learn later, this isn't the last we'll see of her, so she'll have to, sadly, suffer for just a little while longer. These notes and additions are part of what make this remake one of the best. It's not only more connected to the rest of the franchise, but the storytelling is leaps and bounds ahead of the old Jill sandwich days. The voice acting is much better in this game, and the story itself has been uplifted to a higher standard of quality. The game is overall just better in every way. It's clear that Shinji Mikami felt that more could be done with Resident Evil 1, and I think we can now finally lay those ambitions to rest. As RE1 Remake is not only the best iteration of Resident Evil 1, the best remake to ever be made for the franchise, dare I say it might even be the single greatest Resident Evil game to ever be made. Many signs signal when a game company is running out of ideas for its franchise. The first is multiple ports and iterations of the same games, and the second is doing a prequel, because if we can't go forward in time, we may as well go back and fill in the gaps, and that's what Resident Evil 0 plans to do. As the title suggests, 0 takes place before Resident Evil 1. We've heard about the events of Raccoon City and the Arklay Mountains, but what really happened? How was the T-Virus made, and how did this obsession of umbrellas begin? It starts with Rebecca Chambers, as her and the STARS Bravo team went to investigate a series of bizarre murders that happened on a train. Bravo team quickly found evidence of a fugitive named Billy Cohen, said to be sentenced to death soon. Rebecca believes that he may very well be behind the murders that occurred here. Going inside, she'll see that some of the people have been malformed or eaten, and another transforms in front of her into a pair of leeches. The leeches quickly overtake her, but she's saved by that very same convict. Forced to work together, the goody two-shoes nice cop is going to have to get along with the mean, angry convict if they plan to make it out of here alive. So it's got a classic setup. Two people of polar opposite personalities forced to settle their differences to survive. 0 wants to set itself apart from the others though by not following the past games. No more A and B, RE1 overlap, and no Code Veronica switching. It's one continuous playthrough with both characters at the same time. With a touch of a button, you could swap control to another character. You can also command the side character to stay or follow and even give them supplies. I'm still quite impressed that the game is able to keep tabs on your locations and switch between them without much lag in between. And this is important too because you're going to be doing lots of switching. To help make the co-op actually feel cooperative, Billy and Rebecca can only do certain things. Rebecca isn't strong enough to operate some machinery or move boxes, so Billy's meant to do it instead. However, Billy can't mix herbs or fit in tight spaces, so that's where Rebecca comes in. It makes each character pull their own weight, forcing you to actually use both of them rather than stick to one throughout the whole game. Being able to exchange items and also hold more items is a great bonus, and this unique form of interactive storytelling through the cooperative experience is a unique take for the franchise. I personally found it to be incredibly monotonous with how much switching and menuing needs to be done just to do simple tasks, especially when you have to backtrack to grab old items that you left behind on the floor hours ago because there is no item box anymore, but I do think the idea was certainly there. Later games would kind of build off this by giving you a co-op partner, but one that was AI controlled unless you played with a friend. One argument can be made as to the intelligence of the AI in these games. I think there is a reason these are more practical and commonplace than games these days. Trying to juggle two characters at once can be overwhelming for some and could really hamper the experience. But this could easily be hand-waved away as just an ambitious attempt if the characters you played as actually contained interesting personalities or stories. I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but they don't. Something I feel needs to be addressed with prequels is the characters. Why choose these people to feature in the origin tale? 0 doesn't do that and just puts two characters in the story, one of which has no relevance to anything going on. Rebecca Chambers is just Rebecca. 0 does nothing but reaffirm her personality in RE1 as a purveyor of medicines and a helpful hand. No extra backstory is given. I assume this is because we already know Rebecca, but in my defense, like most of this game's cast, We know so little about them that any knowledge would have just been great. Instead, Billy gets much of that attention. As mentioned earlier, Billy is a criminal who is assumed to be the perpetrator of the attack. Obviously, that's not the case. Billy, though, is a convict, and that does worry Rebecca. She demands that Billy tell her the truth about his past, and if the stories are true, that he really did kill 23 people back in the day. According to Billy, he was a part of the Marines and was sent to Africa to intervene in a civil war. His men were outclassed by the locals as they knew the territory better, and they were also operating on wrong information. When they finally got to their mission objective, rather than find a guerrilla hideout, it was a village of innocent people. But the commanding officer did not want to go back empty-handed after how many of his men died for this. So the officers and some others fired on the civilians. Billy refused and tried to stop, but was hit and forced to watch as innocent people died for nothing. What's wild to me is how matter-of-fact this is. Billy is asked about the backstory, he tells it, for some odd reason refuses to tell Rebecca that he didn't kill them and instead leaves her guessing, and then it's never brought up again. Genuinely, this comment about his past is only mentioned right here, and it's never spoken of again. It's not even hinted at or alluded to, the entire conversation is just dropped. Now, one could say this is a commentary of sorts, of how the US gets involved in wars it shouldn't for the sake of money, power, or resources, or maybe a commentary on the psyche of an American soldier. But this is Resident Evil. This game rarely ever comments on anything other than capitalism bad. This is fine, I don't expect Resident Evil to do so, not every game needs to have an underlying meaning attached to it. It could simply just be about the bioweapons and the characters. But I do think it highlights a bit of a flaw with this writing that they drafted up a simple tragic backstory just to provide some mystery to Billy without really understanding the weight of the backstory. It's clear that Billy was never going to be a bad guy. That's the oldest trope in the book. But it was the how that interested me. Was Billy framed? Was it an accidental killing? Those are the questions I was most curious about. What's more fascinating to me is that the game does set up something that could have been used to further Billy. Billy's being transported to a military base to be executed for his crimes. Crimes, of course, he did not commit. Separate from this, we learned during the game that human test subjects were used in experiments. Not as many as future games since this is still early in the timeline, but late enough to where this was still starting to grow. It's common knowledge that criminals or anyone that would be easy to make disappear were used in testing, so why not have Billy be a test subject? In that his exploration of the training facility he and Rebecca walk through is a look at the life he would have experienced. An experience that may haunt him, or serve to reinforce his hatred for Umbrella, knowing that he could have been one of these zombies they gunned down with no remorse. I mean, the train itself is implied to be run by Umbrella in some respect, so there is some evidence in-game that could have been used to further this, but nothing of the sort is mentioned. He's a soldier who didn't commit a war crime, was basically framed, and is now on the run. That's it. Resident Evil 0 seems to want this bond or attachment that comes from learning a character's history and their place in the world to come from the forced nature of your encounter. That you're meant to be piloting them for the entire journey, so naturally you'll come to form opinions about these two during these small interactions of your own gameplay. But I'm not even sure if that was supposed to be intended, or if they simply just gave Billy the most basic of backstories to give him some mystery and identity, knowing that they would just move on to the next thing. The game isn't even invested in its own characters, which makes me hard to be invested in them. They seem like characters that just happen to be involved in the plot, not with people with actual ties to what's going on. I like to think of games like, say, Red Dead Redemption 2, a prequel to the first that has you seeing the Vanderlyn gang and their downfall, which makes their presence in Red Dead 1 make more sense. Or say Halo Reach, a game about the Spartans of Halo that helped defend against one of the first big attacks against the Covenant. They're even directly involved in the game's events as they help ship Master Chief to the Pillar of Autumn, thus starting the events of that series. There is a reason and a purpose behind each character in those games, as they help recontextualize events that you're already familiar with, by showing you the other side of things. Zero's duo could have been replaced with anyone. Rebecca only exists because of her involvement with Stars, and Billy is quite literally a newcomer who never appears again. They don't even do the usual trope of making the side character have a lasting impact on the main one as they continue throughout the series. I mean, come on, she doesn't even use Billy's dog tag. I've never seen her wear that in any of the other materials she's in. At least Claire briefly quoted Steve in Revelations 2. His presence is just to exist as a character for this game, and this game only. Designed to be a foil for Rebecca Chambers, as his tough guy persona contrasts well with her nice girl attitude, but one that rarely ever gets a chance to shine in this game outside the opening. What's strange is that there is a semblance of a story being presented here, but it was dropped as soon as it began. Late in the game, Rebecca finds Enrico, who you'll recall was killed by Wesker in RE1. Enrico is going to check out the mansion that would soon lead to his death. Rebecca ends this conversation with a narration to herself, and how she never saw him again after this point. With Rebecca already confirmed to have survived these events, this seems like the perfect method of storytelling. Have Rebecca reminisce about her time here, reflect on her thoughts regarding Billy or the mission in general. something other than the literal nothing we have for her. I think that's why I'm so drawn to Rebecca in this game out of all the other characters in this franchise. She's the one character who was given main character stardom but never actually given a chance to thrive in it. Rebecca's last appearance outside of non-canonical material or reused scenes from other games is right here. She's mainly been relegated to the animated films these days. It's always puzzled me how little attention they give her. Even in her own game she feels like a side character. Billy's backstory is short and never mentioned again, but it's more time spent on his past than we've ever gotten with Rebecca, and it's such a wasted opportunity to have her final curtain for the games be this. For what it's worth, I could see the appearance of a friendship budding in this game by way of them literally surviving through hell together. But Billy's plot is left unresolved by the end, and Rebecca just carries on with her life, leaving me to wonder if this game would have just been better suited as a solo experience for Rebecca, or if that even would have mattered given her lack of attention by the series at large. But in the game's defense, Resident Evil 0 was not trying to answer questions about Rebecca or Billy. It wanted the origins of Umbrella and things like the T-Virus. You get those answers, but it's rather light on details for it being a supposed origin tale. It's not long into the game before you're introduced to some familiar faces, Albert Wesker and William Birkin. They're confused as to how the T-Virus leaked into the lab, train, and the mansion. It's then that they get a glimpse of a mysterious man in a robe who they seem to know. As it's told in the history books, the founding of Umbrella started from Oswald Spencer and Edward Ashford. Well, this duo is actually a trio, as another man named Dr. James Marcus was one of the original founders. Marcus's diary documents his findings on the progenitor virus. A few months into their discovery, Spencer decided to create Umbrella, although Marcus did not care about the business side of things, so long as he could study the virus. Not long after, Spencer would establish a training facility, which is the mansion that both Rebecca and Billy explore after the train they're on derails. This training facility is meant to train the best and brightest of Umbrella. Wesker and Birkin were classmates here. Scholarly Will and Practical Al, as they were called, this duo was unmatched in their respective skills. The two had a bit of a rivalry, something the staff encouraged to further their growth in their studies, but it seems like the two came to an understanding and realized their complementary skill set. Wesker was more suited for combat training and live fieldwork, while William was talented in virology. The two had become quite well known at the facility and earned the favor of some of the founders. But conflict was growing among these founders. Spencer wanted to use the progenitor virus as a money-making tool, while Marcus was dedicated to the research aspect. Spencer essentially started commercializing what Marcus believed was honest research. But it was during this research that Marcus had found that by mixing the base of progenitor with leached DNA, he could make a new strain, a strain he would call the T-Virus. Building off our previous discussions, given this is the origin of the series, it's assumed that the T-Virus strains found in RE1, 2, and Code Veronica were derivatives of Dr. Marcus's work. But progress on both viruses was slowing down. Dr. Marcus was testing the progenitor virus on mammals for bioweapon applications, but came out with varying degrees of success. At the time, he had just used rodents and other animals, and he had felt that he had hit a wall. He then started questioning the applications of human testing and if that would serve to alleviate his stagnation. Over time, Marcus would involuntarily take some of the staff and use them as test subjects, dumping their corpses in the sewer system to get rid of evidence. Hidden behind the painting of Dr. Marcus is a secret section of the facility with dozens of jail cells and torture devices, all with dried blood on them. Some had caught on to this, but anyone who dared question it would end up just like the people they were investigating. Marcus had also started growing more attached to his leeches. He noticed how they respond to him almost as if they saw him as a father. But more conflict began to brew as Marcus found evidence of people snooping around his office, which he presumes to be people on Spencer's payroll. He planned on announcing his research on the T-Virus at the next meeting to solidify his position and collect his rewards, but it only served to paint a larger target on his back. In the middle of experimenting on his leeches, Umbrella operatives came in and killed Marcus. Looking over him was Wesker and William, who planned to take his research and reap the rewards of it. Marcus's body was then disposed of the very same way he disposed of the others, but some of the leeches made their way into the sewers and somehow melded with Dr. Marcus. They seem to have gained some kind of sentience as the leeches formed into a younger Dr. Marcus, the mystery man in the robe. They also have a fascination with the opera. Not quite sure what that's about. But this leech queen who now has the memories of Dr. Marcus wants to destroy Umbrella and the world for assassinating him. That's why the T-Virus leaked, as the Leech Queen spread it on the train, lab, and mansion. Wesker and Birkin are quite surprised to see Dr. Marcus alive, even in this state. The two both agree that he must be dealt with. If news comes out about Dr. Marcus's death at the hands of Spencer, Umbrella and Spencer will be finished, along with Birkin and Wesker. Wesker then says it's time to enact his plan. He's going to lure the STARS members into the mansion to acquire combat data. Meanwhile, Birkin plans to stay at Umbrella and continue work on his G-Virus. But not before setting this training facility to blow so that Marcus and all the evidence can be destroyed. During all of this, Billy and Rebecca will make their way through the train before it derails and ends up at the Umbrella training facility. From here, they work their way through the halls to confront the Leech Queen. They fight off the Leech Queen while the lab self-destruct sequence goes off. They open the shutters as it's weak to sunlight, cook the thing alive, and then escape before the base explodes. In the end, Billy and Rebecca go their separate ways. Billy likely goes into hiding or something since he's still a fugitive, where Rebecca will eventually head to the Spencer mansion and get wrapped up in another outbreak that will result in her running from another exploding building, and thus is the story of Resident Evil 0. Resident Evil 0 clearly went above and beyond with the wackiness, something that would become quite commonplace for this franchise. A Queen Leech somehow melding itself to match its creator is not the weirdest thing this franchise will do. As you can probably tell though, the extra details we received were quite slight. All it explains is that 3 people created Umbrella, not 2, and that Dr. Marcus created the T-Virus. I wish there would have been a bit more focus on the established lore, as Zero seems more interested in creating its new lore with the leeches. It's also strange how Wesker is once again relegated to being a side character who only appears in a couple of cutscenes before disappearing. All it shows us is that Wesker was heading to the mansion, something we would know by RE1, on top of name-dropping the G-Virus, which was mentioned in RE2. It's just incredibly vague connections rather than anything meaningful. In an interview with Capcom for the 20th anniversary, they talk about Resident Evil 0, and they mention how one of the things that made 0 interesting was that it was sort of a super secret side episode hidden in Raccoon City's history. They felt that retelling the deaths of Bravo Team would have been too boring since fans already knew this, so they decided that rather than focus on the events of the trilogy, they instead focus on how 0 connects to 1. This seems to run counter to their intentions because they quite literally name-drop the events of Resident Evil 1, 2, Code Veronica, and Survivor at the beginning of the game, implying that this was all connected. Plus, it's a prequel. It's inherently going to be connected to these games whether they wanted it to or not. Ironically, the game even has some continuity errors because of this. Firstly, this means that Rebecca has already experienced an outbreak like this and yet never mentions this to Chris. I love the implication that Rebecca just went through hell not too long ago, only to somehow forget that during Resident Evil 1. Now, is she feigning ignorance on purpose so that she doesn't have to go through all this again and spare herself the trauma? That'd be pretty cool, but the games definitely don't acknowledge that, and I'm certainly putting in more thought than the games did. At the end of the day, is Resident Evil 0 at least a good prequel? Sort of. It explains some of the details that the games didn't touch upon. It will ruin the reveal of Wesker being a bad guy, but if you're willing to parlay with that, then it's not really a bad game to start with. I think playing the previous games first, then playing 0 will make the scenes a bit better, especially the ones with William and Wesker, because this game seems designed to be less like a prequel and more like a look under the curtain at stuff you didn't see, so that prior knowledge is useful. Although of course my golden rule always takes top priority, and that's if you like the game or are interested in it, just play it regardless of the order. You'll get a much more rewarding experience playing the game you actually enjoy, rather than forcing yourself to go through a few others before getting to the one that interests you, as even though I didn't enjoy 0 too much, that doesn't mean you won't either. And I should state that even though the info was minimal, it's welcome regardless. But I still can't help but feel that the info we got barely answered much at all. To look ahead to the future, there are 2 games, called Umbrella Chronicles and Darkside Chronicles. These games retell the old games from Resident Evil 0 to Code Veronica, while also adding in some unique details to help close some holes in the lore. Now, we could certainly argue if it's worth playing through a condensed version of games you've already played, and we certainly will when we get to those games, but those games knew going in the info was key. These games had a few unique cutscenes as well as a ton of files that either add new conversations that we've never seen or contextualize old events we already know. Even if 90% of the game is just repeat experiences, the extra stuff is appreciated. Resident Evil 0 set out to be an origin story, to explain the origin of Umbrella, and yet it only briefly touches upon it. This is especially troubling when we look even further into the future, and realize that the story of Umbrella is far from over. This origin and the people involved in its creation will be retold and explained again and again, leaving me to wonder what Resident Evil 0 really added in the long run. But Resident Evil 0 was a sign of things to come. We were able to control both characters at roughly the same time, so what if we handed over that control to a second player? Capcom had tried their hands at a Resident Evil multiplayer game around the late 90s, closer to the release of RE2. Concepts and ideas were thrown around, but developer Noritaka Funamizu had found that early testers focused less on cooperative survival and more on self-preservation. He came to the conclusion that Resident Evil was scary because of its lack of multiplayer, that you had to do everything yourself, so the idea was put on hold. But it wouldn't be long until we arrived at the 2000s, and something that really started to take off around this time was online multiplayer. While multiplayer games have existed for years, the console was slow to catch up. Sega's Dreamcast was arguably one of the early adapters of this, with the PlayStation 2 and Xbox following suit. Names like the PlayStation Network or Xbox Live are commonplace these days, but were new and innovative ideas at the time. Being able to play with others online without a LAN connection was a prospect that interested many. With this in mind, Capcom then designed 3 games based around network-based online play in order to catch on to the hype. The hope was that one of these games would at least reach 1 million sales. If one did, then it was all successful. The first one was Auto Modelista, a cel-shaded racing game that released to poor reviews and even poorer sales. They repackaged the game with new features, released the game in Japan, and then launched this new version for the first time in the West, but that too wasn't enough to start a large following. The second online game that they made was a bit of a niche title, one that you may not have heard of, called Monster Hunter. As the name suggests, it's a game about hunting monsters in a variety of ways. Suffice to say, Capcom struck gold. The franchise has continued to push out new releases on a frequent basis, with many getting consistent post-launch updates that come with new monsters and items. 22 years later, and Monster Hunter is still as popular as ever. It's massed over 120 million sales, and the newly released Monster Hunter Wilds and the upcoming Monster Hunter Stories 3 continue to keep people's attention. Who knew the concepts of stalking, hunting, killing monsters, and then wearing their skin-like coats would be a hit with gamers? But Resident Evil was Capcom's single biggest franchise, a statement that's as true now as it was 20 years ago. So when new technology and new ideas are being passed around the office, Resident Evil will always get a slice of that pie. And so that leads to our third entry in the plan, Resident Evil Outbreak. Rather than give us something new though, Capcom asked us, are we really done with Raccoon City? The answer to that is no, apparently. Resident Evil Outbreak stars 8 completely new characters to the franchise. Each of them was at a bar during the night Raccoon City was attacked. The objective, as it often is to escape. There are 5 scenarios per game and 2 games, or files, as they call it, to go through. Each scenario is basically a Resident Evil game but in miniature, a roughly 1 or so hour journey filled with puzzles and survival horror. You can choose to do it alone with AI teammates or with friends, but you'll need to hurry. Each character is infected with the T-virus, and that counter keeps going up so long as you keep playing, progressing even faster if you've been bitten. We'll talk about the scenarios and the story in just a bit, because prior to starting the game, you're able to choose who you play as, and the cast of Outbreak is by far its greatest strength from a mechanical and narrative perspective. Multiplayer games over the years have given rise to new concepts or terms like mains, characters or weapons that a given player uses the most, often because it identifies with them the strongest. Outbreak carries over this tradition with its cast. Mechanically speaking, each one has something special about them. Yoko comes with a backpack, so she has 8 inventory spaces instead of 4. Alyssa gets a lockpick to help open some of the doors, Jim can fall to the ground and play dead, making him less likely to be attacked, and so on. The difference makes each one feel completely unique and even changes how the scenarios are played. In one scenario, Wild Things, you can find yourself unable to progress past a certain point because all the knobs on the doors are dislodged. Alyssa could just pick these with her lockpicks. She's no lockpicking lawyer, but she gets the job done well enough. Without her, you'll have to damage the door, meaning you either shoot it or you do this. Promise, this actually works. Any second now it will.
I'm not sure.
So there is value in replaying scenarios with other characters, as they fundamentally change how a given encounter can play out. The crew also comes equipped with a unique personality and backstory. Alyssa is a reporter, so a lot of her dialogue is about uncovering the mysteries of the outbreak and then threatening to expose them. Yoko actually had her memories erased and is also ex-Umbrella. But a lot of her dialogue is poetry or metaphor. She reflects on her life and the meaning of things. Mark was a vet in Vietnam, so he often speaks about his experience in Nam and how Raccoon City ain't much different now. This dialogue does little to advance the main plot, but they offer some uniqueness to the cast, which, coupled with their different abilities, makes you likely to gravitate towards a specific character for whatever reason pleases you best. The only real issue with Outbreak is in its main draw. A lot of this is great, but in 2026, multiplayer isn't as viable. There are third-party servers running the game in place of real servers that shut down over a decade ago. But more often than not, you'll likely have to call up some buddies to join you if you want a full game. And solo can be a nightmare sometimes since the AI doesn't follow you. They take off right from go, oftentimes coming back with new items you've never seen or just straight up disappearing. I have no idea how any of this works behind the scenes, but I did a scenario with Kevin and Yoko where Kevin just disappeared for most of its runtime. Yoko stuck close by and only occasionally disappeared, but I genuinely thought Kevin had died because I saw him for only a few minutes. He even disappeared during the final boss fight too, only to come back after it was over like that one classmate who did none of the work but still got credit for the project. To offer some communication, you're allowed to call your teammates, which can help direct them, but the AI can only ad-lib back. Ad-libs are meant to be dialogue that isn't commands, but not only is this more often than not just random nonsense and doesn't actually add anything meaningful, Someone at Capcom decided that the AI must speak every 5 seconds.
Just do it!
Hello there.
Never.
It is just this for over an hour. It also seems like the AI cannot use their special abilities unless you play as them. I've never seen Cindy pack herbs in her bag, so I'm not entirely sure if she can use it as an AI. Alyssa has also never used a lockpick, and George never mixed any herbs I gave him. But even with the hiccups and frustrations, Outbreak solo is possible, especially if you lower the difficulty to account for the lack of real teammates. But what's missed most is the fun of it. The concept of running through building after building as a team is what makes Outbreak come alive. Strategizing your next move one moment, then screaming as you run down the hall the next. The storytelling of Outbreak is one that is less focused on actual in-game narrative, but rather the situations you get up to with your friends. There's a reason why multiplayer games can be so entertaining, because bringing a friend along for the ride makes the experience twice as enjoyable. And a lot of that is lost when playing Outbreak these days, cutting off a huge chunk of Outbreak's purpose as a game. What makes this especially troubling is that it was clear from the get-go that narrative cohesion was also not a high priority for the team. There are some major continuity issues with these games. Outbreak File 1 was successful enough to get a File 2. Each game has 5 scenarios with the same 8 characters. The end of File 1 shows the missiles that blow up the city, but File 2 also ends with those very same missiles. Further, there is no canonical choice here since you pick who you play as, or in the sequel pick the whole team. The scenarios also have no connective tissue at all. In the first, you escape a horde of zombies and ride a truck to safety, only to then be in an umbrella lab for the second, followed by a hospital in the third. None of the dialogue in-game actually implies that these are connected events, but even then, putting a timeline within just one of these games is confusing enough. That being said, there is a glimpse of a story here. See, I'm of the mind that each character in Outbreak was at the bar, but then they split when the attack occurred. These scenarios then represent one person's specific journey, because some of the characters do have special interactions or cutscenes exclusive to them. Cindy shows up in File 2 Scenario 1, Yoko gets a cutscene in File 1 Scenario 2. There's another scenario tailored towards Alyssa, another for David and George, and so on. So I'm under the assumption that each character went through their specific scenarios while trying to escape. Although that still leaves out a few scenarios and the 2 endings. Frankly though, thinking like this does run counter to what Outbreak is trying to be. A multiplayer game. It's common nowadays for multiplayer games to have the essence of a story, one that often has you suspending your disbelief, such as how hero shooters often have opposing factions on the same team. The one thing these devs understand though is that multiplayer is the focus. The devs don't want the story to hamper the multiplayer experience, the thing that most people are coming to this game for, so there is really no reason to harp on its inconsistency. To its credit though, Outbreak does at least try to create some engaging narratives within these scenarios. So while the canonicity of the entire game is a mess, there's at least some thoughtful exploration happening in the actual chapters. The flashback scenario is a notable example. You start in the middle of a cabin and are escorted to a hospital by an old man. The bridge gives out behind you, so you have no choice but to go through the hospital. But throughout the scenario, you're attacked by weird plant monsters and an old man with an axe. Like all the other scenarios, the real focus is on escaping, but if you read the notes, you find that the hospital was experimenting with drugs supplied by Umbrella. The staff quickly learned that all of their data was being used to make bioweapons. But Umbrella had them under their control, and also made sure they weren't disturbed. As when a reporter named Kurt came to the hospital to try and uncover their schemes, he was killed and no one found out. The administrator of the hospital has also learned to be the old man with the axe, and that the reason he complied with all of this is because his wife was terminally ill, and he was trying desperately to find a cure for her illness. In another scenario, we actually get to see the RPD before RE2. It even shows how Marvin got bit and how he ended up in the office when Leon and Claire first meet him. Not every scenario has a story like this, others are really just about the layout, but there is still something to like there too. And then there's of course the characters and their individual stories and how these tie into the given scenarios. Alyssa has a unique ending for that aforementioned scenario because there are visions of Kurt when he died in the hospital. Upon seeing this, she vows to break the truth on this story and help avenge her friend. Yoko's unique scene from the other scenario ties into her story, as it's revealed that she was an active participant in the T-virus experiments. It was this realization that made her want to wipe her memories. These are few and far between, but these moments do add some life to the scenarios, while giving brief priority to a cast member so they can momentarily shine. The scenarios themselves even carry within them some of this variety. At least in File 2, different difficulties can change the location of key items or requirements necessary to progress. In Wild Things, you fight an elephant as the final boss, but if you kill it during the first encounter, a lion replaces it. The flashback scenario has 3 separate endings. After the final boss has been killed, the Axeman reappears to attack you. If you don't attack him, you get one ending, but if you do, you get to see his POV during the building's collapse, which shows the old man holding the corpse that was inside the plant creature, which turns out to be his wife. Notes in game show that he went mad and started seeing his dead wife as the plant, only to realize that she was actually inside the plant. He's also been feeding people to the plant for years. That's why he insisted we follow him to the hospital in the first place. Further, the bridge that collapses is on a timer. If you happen to be on the other side of the bridge when that happens, there's a whole new route you have to take to get to a different bridge which leads back to the city. The survivors also comment on this failure since they're just going back to the city rather than away from it. There's even a small side quest in here which involves you talking to a mother inside the cabin you started the scenario in and then finding her daughter. Most of these split decisions are mainly in File 2, a great example of the sequel improving on the original, but it shows just how much effort was put into these scenarios. They really are like mini stories, and that's really where the narrative of Outbreak shines. Hundreds of thousands of people lived in Raccoon City. These games just show us a few of these scenarios these survivors encountered. It's not really important to think about who was there, who died, who didn't, and when did it happen. It's better to just look at these as glimpses into the world of Raccoon City and how everyone had their own issues to deal with. The final scenes of each game are also quite good in how they cap off the story, even if they both contradict each other. Both scenarios have you face off against a tyrant, although how it goes down depends on the file. You also get to learn a bit more regarding the ins and outs of Umbrella's operations here in Raccoon City, although it's not anything groundbreaking. File 1 then has you escaping with a vial of daylight, which would be used to counter the effects of the T-virus, while File 2 shows us what the crew was up to since surviving Raccoon City. Most are relaxing and enjoying their lives, while other people like Yoko and Alyssa seem to be working to undermine Umbrella after experiencing the horrors that they went through. Outbreak is a game I did not expect to like. It just didn't seem like my kind of game. I still think the single player experience holds me back from fully appreciating the title, but even still, I could see the love that was put into it. Because really, that's what Outbreak has the most of. It may have a disjointed plot and questionable AI intelligence, but it's got some interesting miniature narratives, unique gameplay. More than anything else, Outbreak has heart. I think that's why out of all the games in this video, I want Outbreak to receive some kind of remake or remaster. With Capcom releasing numerous remakes for 2, 3, and 4 in quick succession, lots of talk has been centered around what's next. The runners-up are either 5, 0, or Code Veronica. While I'm certainly on Team Code Veronica, I cannot deny that seeing a resurgence of Outbreak is something I'd prefer more. Now, it's not like Outbreak failed or anything. File 1 sold well. It crossed the 1 million barrier that they were hoping for. But despite vague sales numbers, it seems as though File 2 sold poorly. More importantly though, nowadays it's basically become a game that's been lost to time, and one that is often not talked about as much when it comes to discussing the early era of the franchise. But that doesn't mean it has to be left alone forever. Capcom is not shy about releasing multiplayer games for the franchise, although most of them have done pretty poorly. Outbreak has something. It's got a formula no other multiplayer or co-op experience in this franchise has. So I think a remaster or at least a port to modern systems could do wonders for its reputation. Post-launch support is also quite common amongst games these days, which could greatly benefit this new Outbreak. It's reported that the initial plan was to have 18 scenarios, the team even having close to 40 different ideas mapped out for the game, but due to the limited space of the hard drives and time constraints they were under, it was a pipe dream at best. But while I would have held this belief a few years ago, nowadays I think I'm more than certain that this is the route Capcom should go. I'll keep spoilers light since it's not out yet, even though we still know very little about the game anyway. But at Summer Games Fest 2025, we got the news that Capcom was actively making the new Resident Evil 9. Shown in the trailer is the new protagonist Grace Ashcroft, daughter to Alyssa Ashcroft, the very same character from Outbreak. Now, this is not the first time Outbreak has been acknowledged like this by the main series. Alyssa was already featured in RE7 via a newspaper article. But to have such a direct connection and an actual appearance in-game is something Outbreak hasn't had yet. To help with sales, Capcom has also bundled these multiplayer games with these single-player experiences. Resident Evil Resistance was bundled with RE3 Remake, and RE-Verse was with RE8 Village. It would be a complete missed opportunity to not bundle Outbreak with RE9 or at least offer this post-launch. Years ago, the thought of Outbreak even being recognized would have required a miracle. But now, who knows? In the future, we may very well be returning to Raccoon City again under much different circumstances. These games that we've discussed so far are what I like to call the early era of the franchise, a time when Resident Evil was just getting its sea legs, and a time when the narrative was much more narrowly focused. While games have expanded outside the scope of Raccoon City, it's only slight, and it still focuses on bioweapons made from viruses at the hands of Umbrella. But I think it's become pretty clear that innovation was a particular sore spot for Capcom at this stage. We've redone lots of the old story here, by either reinterpreting or recontextualizing those early events. We've heard the story of the Spencer Mansion twice, and the Raccoon City outbreak from 3 different perspectives. Even games that try to expand the story past the Midwestern borders end up looping back around to it anyway by either referencing Umbrella or the viruses used in the Outbreak, such as the T and G. Resident Evil at this stage is nothing without Raccoon City. It tried to expand the story with Code Veronica, but its clear defiance at actually ending things implied that Capcom still wanted to keep the door open in case they came up with more ideas. Capcom's decision to make 0, Remake 1, and Outbreak largely varied and were not an immediate sign of stagnancy, but narratively they look backward rather than forward. Code Veronica ended with the promise of a confrontation between Chris and Umbrella. Fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Obviously this line was just fluff and nothing more. A way to hype up the next release that would inevitably kick the can down the line until the can is no more. But on the periphery, there were attempts to expand things, although they had varying degrees of success in doing so. Capcom first tried to see how Resident Evil could function on a handheld device. Their first step into this market was a Game Boy Color port of RE1. But the development was becoming too complicated. RE1 was just too big of a game to fit into a Game Boy, at least not without some significant cuts. It became too much for the team and so it was cancelled, but oddly enough, just a few weeks ago, the website Games That Weren't was able to recover a build of the game that is largely complete. It's not perfect, but it's enough to provide an interesting look at what could have been. I'll leave a link to the website if you'd like to read more or download the game for yourself. Following yet another cancellation, this time being RE2 for Game.com, a handheld made by Tiger Electronics, Capcom decided to just make their own spin-off story, and thus the real Resident Evil Gaiden was born. It stars Barry Burton and Leon Kennedy as they investigate a cruise liner called the Starlight. But it's considered to be in its own continuity due to the ending, as its events are never mentioned anywhere else in the franchise. Capcom would then continue their expansion into other markets by occasionally delving into the world of light guns. Light guns are basically fancy pointers that make it look like a weapon to give off the illusion that you're pointing a gun at a screen. If you've ever went to an arcade that had an FPS game with a plastic gun, then you're quite familiar with the design. Games like House of the Dead, Duck Hunt, and Time Crisis, all of these were games that used this functionality. With many of their games being shooters, Capcom likely thought that this would be a profitable business venture, and so they made the Gun Survivor Trilogy, consisting of Resident Evil Survivor, Survivor 2 Code Veronica, and Dead Aim. Although calling it a trilogy is actually wrong, as a fourth game was included in the series called Dino Stalker based on the Dino Crisis franchise, but we'll keep things in our wheelhouse for now and just talk about the trilogy. Despite their vast differences, they all use the GunCon light gun developed by Namco specifically for PlayStation consoles, although you can still use a DualShock controller if you wish. Resident Evil Survivor would be the first game made in this new trilogy, and immediately it wants to make clear that it's going to be something different, as the intro crawl states that there was another outbreak that happened, and that Raccoon City wasn't the only one. We initially play as some random unknown guy. His name is intentionally vague because they were on board a helicopter, but due to a crash they awoke with amnesia. He does not remember who he is or where he ended up, so half the mystery is piecing together the story of the outbreak and your identity. Survivor is an incredibly short game, clocking in at about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours for a full run. The length mainly comes in the form of different paths. At a few points throughout the game, there are a few different doors that give you areas that you can choose from. These add new areas or cutscenes depending on where you go. I initially started by choosing the church followed by the arcade, but there were a few other areas that I could have chosen as well. It's cool in practice, but the choice locks you into that small subsection on the map until you're done. You can't leave or choose any other path or even explore the other paths out of pure curiosity. The game just arbitrarily locks the door behind you so you can't try the other options. It's a little strange, but I assume this was to add a bit more replay value to the game. The story itself is at least semi-compelling. Survivor takes place on Sheena Island, a previously undiscovered location in the Resident Evil franchise. The main antagonist of this game is Vincent Goldman, a representative of Umbrella, who is incredibly selfish and ruthless. Notes around the game tell us that he's had his colleagues at Umbrella killed in order to get ahead. He'd also been conducting experiments on the people of Sheena Island. A note uses words like inferior when referring to the other people on the island. These individuals were kept in prison cells and reportedly smelled awful. Supposedly, Umbrella brings these people to this island so they could be operated on and turned into decent people, as they say. In truth, they were actually being experimented on. The purpose of this facility is to mass-produce tyrants. They do this by extracting a material from the brains of the victims, but it's only able to be extracted from a live person. It cannot be found once the body no longer responds. So each of these people had to have their brains cut open and examined while they were still alive. All of this is laid out in full to the player because it's presented early on that we are Vincent. Vincent uncovers the truth of his own schemes and realizes how horrible he is. The rest of the game is essentially an attempt to redeem himself by saving 2 kids from the outbreak on the island. Except it's known that we aren't Vincent Goldman, but Ark Thompson, a spy sent to investigate the island in hopes of arresting Vincent. It's a bit of a fine twist, but it feels like a bit of a missed opportunity to actually play a bad guy for once. I feel like most series these days are allergic to that idea and are unwilling to make redemptive characters. Still, the twist is fine, but I also wish the game actually showed some of this horror behind the facility, rather than it looking like any other Umbrella facility. There are prison cells, but that's about it. The notes end up conveying more of the horror than the actual game does. Regardless, Ark Thompson regains his memories and remembers that he is a spy who was sent by his dear friend Leon S. Kennedy, Survivor's attempt at bridging the gap between these games, to investigate this island. But now with the island under siege, he now tries to escape it from the undead. But, like clockwork, Umbrella sends in more soldiers to destroy evidence, which includes, you guessed it, another self-destruct sequence. Ark will have to fight off one of the tyrants as it escapes containment before taking off in a helicopter with the kids. Survivor is a fine game, I guess. It is certainly a sign of creative stagnancy, though. We're still dealing with Umbrella and their devious experiments. There's always a tyrant, always staff that details their procedures, always soldiers who come to destroy the evidence, and always a self-destruct sequence. It's becoming really played out at this stage, and unfortunately we have plenty of that still left. The light gun was supposed to provide some sense of novelty, but even then, it's just old school Resident Evil fit with reused assets and sound effects. And my hope was for this to be cast aside in the next entry, but I would have to wait a bit longer for that, as the second light gun game, Survivor 2 Code Veronica, was just a retold abridged version of Code Veronica. Capcom had made a deal with Namco to make an arcade tie-in to the Resident Evil series. It was then later revealed that this would be Survivor 2. The game is incredibly short. It consists of about 5 stages, each lasting anywhere between 3 and 7 minutes. You go through these areas you've already visited in Code Veronica, grab a key, and then kill a boss at the end. You can either play as Steve or Claire. You can choose to go in alone and have the AI control the other character, or bring a buddy along with you. You get an assortment of weapons, which is nice, but the camera tilts towards this unflattering angle whenever an enemy is behind you. I never really needed to know if Steve had a bald spot, but it's good that he has a good head of hair on him. And, that's about it. Oh, right, the Nemesis. How could I forget about the Nemesis? Yeah, you have a limited time to complete the level or he just shows up and wrecks your day. He can't be killed, so you just have to avoid him and deal with it. No idea why he's here, although I guess they were kind enough to at least add a lore document that explains that this is a different Nemesis they sent to the island. So, I appreciate the attempt at trying to rationalize all this. The plot itself has also been slightly altered to fit with the new game, such as having Claire fight Alexia in the mansion's hallway. But the big twist, though, is that this is all in Claire's head. She was dreaming while in the VTOL with Chris and reimagined her encounter, but with Steve instead. The game is, again, certainly not putting this much effort into this, but I like the interpretation that Steve's death affected her so much that she actively dreamed of her conquering and escaping this place with him. Still makes me question how she dreamed of the Nemesis despite never encountering it, but it is really not worth nitpicking this. Although context is important. I'm not sure about the other games, but there is photographic evidence that Survivor 2 was a legitimate arcade machine, not just a light gun console game. In that way, I could see this being a bit more palatable. A short experience that will likely eat some quarters. It doesn't take hours and thus you aren't stuck on the machine for a while, but it's got enough content to keep you satisfied for a bit. The stages themselves are also short enough that they could fit in during a nice intermission, like waiting for the food to arrive. As an arcade machine, I'm sure this is a blast. As a PS2 game, I'll pass. So, not exactly a great track record so far. At least the next one's a bit better. It's got a completely new story, new characters, new setting, and visually it looks pretty great. Like Survivor 1, we have a new Outbreak, an unnamed, unheard of attack that was never mentioned in the history books because they just came up with it now for this game. Sephiroth knockoff named Morpheus was an Umbrella staff member. They were known for their lack of empathy, as they didn't really care too much about the staff's health. They were sent a letter of resignation claiming that Umbrella was firing them over their involvement in the outbreak in the Arclay Mountains. With Morpheus having no relation to that facility, it's assumed that they were framed. Morpheus was still able to hold a position of power in a sense, as while they were not involved with Umbrella directly, they were able to create a counter-faction with a few others. 3 days before the start of the game, some T-virus was stolen by Morpheus' terrorist group from a lab in France. Then yesterday, a cruise liner owned by Umbrella called Dispenser Rain, because, this jackass's ego can't be high enough it seems, was attacked and the T-virus was spread across the cruise line. Morpheus plans to rid the world of ugly things and create a world of beauty. To start, they plan on leaking the T-virus in the US and China, and threaten both governments with their missiles. Their demand is $5 billion, so both governments sent in an agent to take them down, that being Bruce McGivern and Fong Ling. Unlike Code Veronica, which went in-engine, some of Dead Aim's cutscenes are CGI. I admittedly am not well versed with this kind of technology, I'm just a bum who plays a lot of games. But I'm obsessed with this kind of early 2000s era of CG. There's something uncanny about it that I can't quite put my finger on. I just really like this old style quite a bit, even if I can't really articulate why. Although Dead Aim commits an incredibly grave sin within those cutscenes. The audio of these characters can be incredibly hard to hear sometimes, so subtitles are necessary, but for some odd reason the subtitles don't match the words.
The government seems to care an awful lot about where you are. Not even their best agent, which makes you expendable.
Okay, I admit that wasn't exactly a bad example, it still got the point across.
Should have left by now. Somewhere in America, there's a kitten stuck in a tree, desperately needing your help.
Alright, come on, that time you didn't even try. It's very likely that the initial draft and the final draft changed substantially, or the characters ad-libbed a few lines and the people involved in the captions never knew or didn't have enough time to change it. It makes for a really annoying experience sometimes, especially when the mismatched lines are particularly egregious.
You will not destroy this for me.
This is also incredibly unrelated and has no story significance, but I'd be remiss if I didn't share this incredible detail. This game absolutely hates epileptic people. Using the assault rifle in this game flashes the entire screen. I won't show it for those of you in the audience who are prone to that sort of thing because it is blinding. I made the mistake of playing this game late at night with the lights off, and even I started to feel some strain in my eyes afterwards. I guess the idea is that you'd be a little bit farther away from your TV when you're playing, but it's still absurd. This is a genuine, real frame that exists in this game. It's so bright it covers the UI. How is that even possible? Fortunately, it's only the assault rifle. Stupidly, it's only the assault rifle. I have no idea why this is the only gun that does this. Reeling it back a bit though, the gameplay is standard light gun shooting like the previous games, but it's clear that the story was taking more creative liberties than the others. Morpheus though is another example of the kind of growing pains that come from the series' villains. They rarely ever have an end goal outside of world domination or money. The TNG virus are made because of money and power, and Alexia planned on ruling the world as the queen, but that would likely just cause the end of the world in the process. This is consistent with some of the future villains like Wesker's iconic complete global saturation thing from RE5. Morpheus is much the same. In a unique twist, they actually want the world to become beautiful. They see beauty as the ultimate power. Interestingly, they've reportedly had cosmetic surgery done to make themselves look younger, and even used a combination of the TNG virus to further their goal. What's wild is that because of this, Morpheus suddenly gets a lot hotter. The virus turned them into a female tyrant, a first for the series, and yet they don't seem particularly bothered by this at all. In fact, they're actually relishing in it. By extracting certain parts of the TNG virus, Morpheus was able to exhibit electrical properties. But as we've seen from the past games, the research that goes into these things is meticulous and more often than not deliberate. So I'm of the mind that Morpheus knew this would happen, thus developing feminine features is a part of their goal. Ultimately though, what really bothers me is the lack of explanation here. I mean, seriously, this is like the most unique villain we've ever had in this game so far, and yet we don't know a single reason why they do what they do. Why does Morpheus believe beauty to be something that demands absolute fealty? Where do they even conceive of such a concept? It's never explained. They're just a being with incredibly luscious hair with a demand that the world's people slay and serve to their heart's content. Still, Morpheus is an interesting villain just on the merits of being different. This level of quality does also extend to the main characters as well. Bruce and Fang Ling meet a couple of times, and it's not on good terms. They get into a bit of a conflict as it seems like they're trying to one-up each other, but the sexual tension here is immense. It doesn't take long for Bruce to fall for her. It reminds me of the relationship Leon and Ada have. Both guys have basically been manipulated by the good looks of the girls, and they also have just enough charm to keep the boys on their leash, so to speak. There's something infectious and dangerous about them that they can't help take an interest in. But both duos have this kind of cat and mouse game that they play with each other to further enhance this tension. They also go out of their way to save each other even at the expense of themselves or the world. Morpheus was injured at the beginning of the game, which forced them to use the TG virus on themselves. This duo is then occasionally pursued by Morpheus while they continue their search for a way to stop the missiles. The ship ends up crashing into a landmass, which happens to be the lab where Umbrella was operating out of. Down at the bottom of the base is those missiles. But in having captured Fang Ling, Morpheus plans to use her as bait to get Bruce to come to them, and it worked. Despite the threat of the world, Bruce saved Fang Ling first, and even ripped out a tracking chip in her arm earlier. See, the Chinese government was actually going to cave in to Morpheus' demands, so Fang Ling wasn't needed and was just a liability. So they used a literal laser to kill her from space, although Bruce saved her before that could happen. This act of heroism rubs off on Fang Ling, who starts to grow more fond of Bruce the more they meet. Bruce then defeats Morpheus, but like Alexia before them, their second form is an ironic twist, going from beautiful and feminine to an amorphous blob. Morpheus' second death was so destructive that it seems to have also blown up the missiles before they could launch. While it seems like all hope was lost for our duo, they reappear right at the end, having survived the explosion. But rather than continue this cat and mouse game, Fong Ling and Bruce kiss, implying that there is more to their relationship, although they never appear again in the franchise in any capacity, so we're left to speculate on our own. The Gun Survivor games are a real anomaly in the franchise. They're often not spoken about, and for very obvious reasons. They were designed to cater to a specific niche, a niche that was lost as time goes on. Even then, the novelty of the light gun didn't really help all that much. Survivor 1 and 2 were just uninteresting to me, especially Survivor 2. Dead Aim was a game that I was surprised to enjoy, but a lot of that definitely stemmed from the darker atmosphere and the music. The stories for all three of these games were quite poor, with only Dead Aim really having anything compelling by way of its dynamic duo and villain. I covered these though because they show a clear path that Capcom was heading towards. I mentioned earlier about the narrative starting to loop around themselves and revisit the same old content. These games show that Resident Evil did try to expand, but they were barely considered hits at the time. The older games worked, these didn't, so why not mooch off the older releases for as long as possible? So it was back to the grind, the old reliable, and that's how we got games like RE1 Remake, Zero, and Outbreak. Capcom needed to find a solution, and fast. We have years of hindsight, so we know that they did in the end. But even then, if Resident Evil really was just this era, it would still be remembered as one of the greats. Resident Evil popularized the survival horror genre, and being a genre-establishing and defining game is no easy feat. It's because of Resident Evil that we have so many horror games on the market. Within Capcom's own studios, moves are being made to create games based on the RE formula, which gave rise to the likes of games like Onimusha and Dino Crisis. Shinji Mikami a few years from now would also take the lessons and ideas he had from Resident Evil and create the evil within. Other studios were also quick to make their own survival horror games, and while they may not have been inspired by Resident Evil directly, its influence on the genre inherently made it responsible to an extent. Another Japanese company called Konami back in 1999, around the release of RE3, made Silent Hill. A game with survival horror elements like Resident Evil, but one that focused more on the story and psychological horror rather than the action and bioweapons. I do actually like Silent Hill more than Resident Evil, to be honest. In fact, it's my favorite horror franchise of all time. But Silent Hill fit into an unexplored niche that no one was filling, leading to fans of either game crossing over to the other to experience something fresh. I also covered the franchise some time ago if you want to know more about that series, so you can check that out there. It includes every Silent Hill game except Silent Hill F, since the video was released before it came out, but I do have an informative story video if you'd like to know what happened in that game. You can click the eye in the top right now, or it's down in the description. But even outside the games industry, lots of material was being made for the franchise. Lots of manga and extra books like the Wesker Report and Resident Evil Archives were made to fill in the gaps of lore and added some small new parts on top of it. Most notably though, in 2002, director Paul W.S. Anderson created the first Resident Evil live-action movie, which would go on to be a 6-film series. Either way, it's safe to say that the franchise had lots of influence. It could have wrote off that for years, but Capcom was insistent on continuing the franchise and continuing to rake in sales. They just needed to come up with something fresh, something new, something we hadn't seen before. Eventually, they did. It would be a game that would not only change Resident Evil, but also change the gaming industry as a whole. But we'll talk about that in the next video. Thanks for watching. Thank you all for watching part 1. I really hope you've enjoyed it so far. Part 2 should be out a week or two after this video is live, so look out for that. We'll be covering the middle era of the franchise where some of the best, worst, and boldest games reside. For now, thank you again for just making it this far. Like the video if you enjoyed and subscribe if you're new. Thanks to my returning viewers for coming back to another video, and to the patrons who continue to support the work I do here. Take care everyone. Goodbye.